What if ancient history wasn't glory, but deception? What if the monuments, temples, and kings we praise were built on violence, corruption, and secrets buried under centuries of silence? Ancient artifacts weren't crafted to honor greatness. They were used to hide the truth. Behind Egypt's shining walls and Rome's polished floors linger evidence of erased stories and suppressed power. Tonight, we dig into 30 artifacts that expose what they never wanted you to know. Not the schoolbook version, the dark version, the forbidden version. If you crave unsettling truths, subscribe. Drop your location in the comments: Manchester at midnight, Sydney at sunrise, Toronto at 3 a.m. Let's dive in. These aren't isolated mysteries. They form a pattern. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The year is 1901. The Mediterranean sun beats down on a small diving crew working off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera. They're salvaging a shipwreck, expecting amphoras and maybe some bronze statues. What they find instead will haunt archaeologists for the next century: a corroded lump of bronze and wood. Unremarkable at first glance. But when it's cleaned, when the layers of limestone and coral are carefully removed, gears appear, dozens of them, interlocking, precise, impossibly complex. This isn't supposed to exist. Not here, not 2,000 years ago. The official story? For decades, museums labeled it a simple navigational device. An astrolabe, perhaps. Nothing special. Just ancient sailors doing ancient sailor things. Move along. But here's what they didn't tell you. The Antikythera Mechanism is a sophisticated astronomical calculator of breathtaking complexity. It contains at least 30 bronze gears. We know this because modern X-ray imaging has revealed the internal structure that Renaissance Europe wouldn't match for another 14 centuries. The device could predict solar eclipses, track the Olympic Games cycle, chart the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, and calculate lunar phases with stunning accuracy. Think about that for a moment. In the 2nd century BCE, someone built a machine that could predict the positions of celestial bodies years in advance. The differential gearing inside, a mechanism that allows gears to rotate at different speeds, wasn't supposed to appear in human technology until medieval clocks. Some of the gears have teeth so small and precise they would challenge a modern machinist. The mechanism was found in a shipwreck dated to approximately 60 BCE, but the device itself is older, likely constructed between 150 and 100 BCE. That means this technology existed when Rome was still a republic, when Julius Caesar hadn't yet crossed the Rubicon, when the Library of Alexandria still stood. Here's where it gets darker. This level of sophistication implies an entire tradition of mechanical engineering, of mathematical knowledge, of astronomical observation that we have no other record of. Where are the prototypes? Where are the workshops? Where are the treatises explaining how to build such things? They don't exist. Or rather, they no longer exist. The mechanism suggests knowledge that was lost, not gradually forgotten, but violently erased. When the Library of Alexandria burned, when Rome fell, when the early Christian church suppressed pagan learning, entire traditions of knowledge vanished. The Antikythera Mechanism is proof of what we lost. It's an echo of a scientific revolution that was strangled in its crib, and it raises an uncomfortable question. What else did they know? What other technologies existed in the ancient world that we've been told were impossible? If they could build this, what couldn't they build? The mechanism sat in museum storage for decades, labeled and forgotten. Because it was too sophisticated to be real, it challenged the narrative. It suggested that ancient people were far more advanced than we'd been taught, and that made it dangerous. Not to our physical safety, but to the story we tell ourselves about progress, about human history moving in a straight line from primitive to advanced. The Antikythera Mechanism proves that history doesn't work that way. Knowledge can be gained, and knowledge can be lost, sometimes deliberately. And this device, this impossible, beautiful, terrifying device, wouldn't be the last artifact that proved it. Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the cradle of civilization, they call it, where writing was invented, where cities first rose from the mud, where humanity supposedly took its first stumbling steps toward modernity. The Sumerian king list should be a straightforward historical document. It's a cuneiform text carved into clay tablets, listing the kings of Sumer in chronological order. Reign after reign, ruler after ruler, the march of history preserved in wet clay and baked hard under the desert sun. Except the list is insane. According to the king list, the first kings of Sumer ruled for thousands of years, not metaphorically, literally. The text claims that before the Great Flood, 8 kings ruled the city of Eridu for a combined total of 241,200 years. One king, Alulim, supposedly reigned for 28,800 years. Another, Enmenluana, held power for 43,200 years. After the flood, the reigns become shorter, but not reasonable. We're talking hundreds of years per king. One ruler allegedly governed for 1,200 years, another for 960. The official story? These are mythological figures, religious propaganda. The Sumerians were exaggerating to make their kings seem more impressive, connecting them to the gods. It's all metaphorical, all symbolic. Don't take it seriously. But here's the problem. The king list doesn't read like mythology. It reads like a bureaucratic record. It's formatted like an administrative document, complete with city names, dynasty names, and the matter-of-fact tone of a census taker. King X ruled in city Y for Z years. Then King A ruled in city B for C years. Over and over. No dramatic narratives. No divine interventions mid-text. Just names and numbers. And even stranger, later in the list, when we reach historical periods we can verify through other sources, the king list becomes accurate. The names match, the sequence matches. Archaeological evidence confirms the rulers and their approximate reign lengths. So, the Sumerians clearly knew how to keep accurate records. They chose not to for the earlier periods. Why? The answer gets darker when you look at what's been erased. Multiple versions of the king list exist, found in different cities and different time periods, and they don't match. Different versions include different kings, skip entire dynasties, or rearrange the sequence. It's not that the Sumerians forgot their history, they rewrote it, deliberately, multiple times. Consider this. In the city of Lagash, rulers commissioned their own inscriptions claiming divine right and eternal legitimacy. But the king list often omits Lagash entirely, or includes only rulers from rival cities. Political rivals were written out of history, their reigns were erased, their monuments were smashed, their names were chiseled off temple walls. The fantastical reign lengths might be code. Some scholars suggest they represent something else: astronomical cycles, religious calendars, or encrypted data we can no longer interpret. Others believe the early sections of the king list are covering up a period of history the later Sumerians wanted to forget. A time of chaos, perhaps, or a previous civilization whose existence complicated the narrative of Sumerian supremacy. Here's what we know for certain. The Sumerians had the technology and literacy to keep accurate records. They chose not to. They deliberately obscured their own history, wrapped it in impossible numbers, and made sure the truth of their earliest periods became inaccessible. The tablet now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford shows clear signs of editorial changes. Names added, names removed, reign lengths altered. This wasn't accidental decay or scribal error. This was intentional revision, and the pattern was just beginning. Because the Sumerians weren't the only ancient civilization to discover that the best way to control the present is to rewrite the past. What exactly were they hiding? Constantinople, 1513. The Ottoman Empire is at its height. Admiral Piri Reis, a skilled cartographer and naval officer, completes a map of the world. Nothing unusual about that. Maps are being updated constantly as explorers push into new territories. Columbus reached the Americas just 21 years earlier. The world is being remapped in real time. But when Piri Reis's map is rediscovered in 1929 during renovations of the Topkapi Palace, scholars notice something impossible. The map shows the eastern coast of South America with remarkable accuracy. It shows the northern coast of Antarctica. Let me repeat that. It shows Antarctica, a continent that wouldn't be officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. The official explanation? Piri Reis never claimed to have drawn the map from his own observations. In his own notes, still preserved on the map itself, he states that he compiled it from approximately 20 older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. He was copying earlier cartographers. Mystery solved, right? Not quite. Because the Antarctic coastline on the Piri Reis map shows the continent without ice. It depicts Queen Maud Land, a region of Antarctica's coast, with mountains, rivers, and coastline details that are currently buried under more than a mile of ice. The kind of geographical features you could only map if the continent were ice-free. Antarctica hasn't been ice-free for at least 6,000 years. Most estimates put the last ice-free period somewhere between 6,000 and 34 million years ago, long before any human civilization we recognize. So either Piri Reis copied from maps that were impossibly ancient, or the maps he copied from were themselves copied from even older sources, sources that predate written history, sources created by civilizations we have no record of. When the map was analyzed by the U.S. Hydrographic Office in 1960, the director of the Weston Observatory stated that the map showed an ice-free Antarctic coast, and that such accuracy would require aerial survey techniques or information from a period when the continent was not covered by ice. Let that sink in. A map from 1513, compiled from ancient sources, accurately depicts geographical features that have been hidden under ice for thousands of years. Features that modern science only confirmed existed in the 1950s using seismic surveys and ice-penetrating radar. Piri Reis himself noted in his inscription that one of his source maps was drawn by Columbus, but others were far older, charts from the time of Alexander the Great, and perhaps older still. The map also shows the Andes Mountains, which run along the western coast of South America, accurate river systems, coastal islands that match modern surveys. The level of detail suggests not just lucky guessing, but systematic exploration. Here's what makes this truly disturbing. If the source maps were accurate, and they demonstrably were, then someone explored and charted these coastlines thousands of years before our current historical timeline suggests anyone had the technology to do so. Someone had ships capable of ocean voyages. Someone had surveying techniques sophisticated enough to create accurate maps. Someone had knowledge of cartographic projection, and then that knowledge vanished. The maps were copied and recopied, degrading over time, their origins forgotten. By the time Piri Reis compiled his version, the source materials were already ancient mysteries, their creators lost to time. Other maps from the same period show similar anomalies. The Orontes Phineas map of 1531 shows the entire Antarctic continent with remarkable accuracy, centered on the South Pole, at a time when European cartographers shouldn't have known Antarctica existed at all. What happened to the civilization that created the original source maps? Where did their knowledge come from? And why was it lost? The map hangs in the Library of Congress now, a beautiful impossibility rendered in ink on gazelle skin. The Turkish government considers it a national treasure. Scholars continue to debate its implications. But the coastline is there, accurate, impossible, real, and the pattern continues. Kujut Rabu, near Baghdad, 1936. German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig is cataloging artifacts from Parthian-era sites when he notices something odd in a museum collection. A clay jar, about 5 inches tall, with a copper cylinder inside. Inside the cylinder is an iron rod. The rod shows signs of corrosion from an acidic substance. Koenig's training is in archaeology, but he recognizes the design immediately. It's a galvanic cell, a battery, circa 200 BCE to 200 CE. The official response? Skepticism. The artifact, critics claimed, was probably just a vessel for storing scrolls. The copper and iron were coincidental. The acid residue was meaningless. Surely ancient peoples couldn't have understood electrochemistry. Except when you fill the jar with an acidic substance, vinegar, lemon juice, or even wine, it generates approximately 1.1 to 2 volts of electricity. Multiple tests have confirmed this. The Baghdad battery works, not theoretically, actually. Several of these jars have been found, all with the same design: clay vessel, copper cylinder, iron rod, sealed with asphalt. They're not random assemblages of materials. They're deliberately constructed devices with a consistent design. So, what were they for? One theory suggests electroplating. The Parthians and Sasanians were skilled metal workers, famous for gilded objects and jewelry. Electroplating, using electrical current to deposit a thin layer of metal onto an object, could explain how they achieved such uniform, thin coatings of gold and silver. Objects have been found from this period with metal plating so thin, and even that modern jewelers struggle to explain how it was achieved without electrochemical processes. Another possibility: these were medical devices. Ancient texts describe treatments involving electric fish, torpedo rays, and electric catfish, used to numb pain or treat headaches. Perhaps the batteries were attempts to replicate this effect. Ancient physicians might have discovered that applying a mild electrical current could provide relief without understanding the underlying mechanism. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. If the Parthians understood electricity well enough to build batteries, what else did they understand? The Baghdad battery suggests a level of experimental science, observation, hypothesis, testing that we're told didn't exist until the Renaissance. Knowledge of electrochemistry appears, then vanishes from the historical record for nearly 2,000 years. No treatises, no explanations, no tradition of teaching passed down. Just these jars, buried in the ground, waiting to confuse archaeologists. The Parthian Empire fell in 224 CE, conquered by the Sasanian Persians. The Sasanians fell to the Islamic conquest in 651 CE. Each transition meant libraries burned, workshops destroyed, knowledge lost. What survived was fragmentary: architectural ruins, scattered artifacts, cryptic references in later texts. The batteries suggest that ancient science was more advanced than we've been taught, not magically, not impossibly, but methodically, through observation and experimentation, through trial and error, the same process we use now, just with different tools. And then that knowledge was lost. Libraries burned, scholars were killed, workshops were abandoned. The careful observations of generations evaporated. When European scientists rediscovered electrochemistry in the 1780s, with Luigi Galvani's experiments on frog legs and Alessandro Volta's invention of the voltaic pile, they had no idea they were reinventing technology that had existed 2,000 years earlier. The Baghdad battery is currently in the National Museum of Iraq, or it was. The museum was extensively looted during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Several artifacts, including at least one of the batteries, disappeared. Their current location is unknown. So now, we've lost them twice. Once 2,000 years ago, when the knowledge of how to build them and what they were for faded from memory. And again in 2003, when the physical objects themselves vanished into the chaos of war. The pattern repeats. Knowledge emerges, knowledge is lost. Sometimes gradually, sometimes violently. The Baghdad battery is proof that human progress isn't a steady upward line. It's a chaotic zigzag, full of dead ends and forgotten breakthroughs. What else did our ancestors discover and then forget? What other technologies lie buried in the ground, their purposes lost, their sophistication dismissed as impossible by scholars who can't imagine that ancient people were just as curious, just as experimental, just as brilliant as we are? The batteries existed, they worked, and then, for 2 millennia, nobody knew. The Nazca Desert in southern Peru stretches for miles, one of the driest places on Earth. Almost no rain, almost no wind. The perfect environment for preservation, which is fortunate because carved into this desert floor is one of the most baffling art projects in human history. The Nazca Lines. From the ground, they're meaningless. Shallow trenches, a few inches deep, cleared of darker stones to reveal lighter soil beneath. They look like random scratches, paths worn by foot traffic, erosion patterns. Nothing special. From the air, they're breathtaking. Massive geoglyphs stretch across the desert. Geometric shapes, spirals, straight lines running for miles with perfect accuracy. And animals. A spider, 150 feet across. A monkey with a spiraled tail. A hummingbird with a wingspan of over 300 feet. A condor. A pelican. Shapes so large and precise that they can only be properly seen from hundreds of feet in the air. The Nazca people created these between 500 BCE and 500 CE. We know this from pottery fragments found at the sites and radiocarbon dating of wooden stakes used in the construction. Over 800 straight lines, 300 geometric figures, and 70 animal and plant designs. The official explanation? Religious ceremony. The Nazca walked the lines in ritual processions, honoring their gods. The designs represented prayers, perhaps, offerings to sky deities who might send rain to this barren landscape. That's a tidy explanation. Satisfying. It fits our understanding of ancient religious practices. Ritual pathways are common in many cultures. Move along, nothing to see here. Except for one problem. Why make them so large that they can't be seen by the people walking them? Why create art that only makes sense from an impossible vantage point? The Nazca had no flying technology, no balloons, no towers tall enough. A person standing on the ground next to the monkey geoglyph sees nothing but scattered rocks and shallow trenches. The design is incomprehensible. Only from 500 feet up does it become a monkey. Some researchers suggest the Nazca could have used hot air balloons. Textile fragments with a tight weave have been found that could theoretically have been used for balloon construction. But no direct evidence of balloon technology exists. No baskets, no burners, no traditions or myths about flight. The astronomical alignment theory is more compelling. Many of the lines point towards significant astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising and setting points of stars and planets. The Nazca may have been creating a massive astronomical calendar, marking the movements of celestial bodies across the year. This would explain the precision and the scale, but it doesn't explain the animals. A 300-foot hummingbird doesn't mark a solstice. It doesn't predict a star's rising. It's just a hummingbird, beautifully drawn, impossibly large. Here's where the theories get uncomfortable. What if the Nazca lines were meant to be seen, not by the Nazca themselves, but by someone or something else? Sky beings, gods, visitors. The academic community hates this suggestion. It smacks of pseudo-archaeology, of ancient aliens nonsense that undermines serious scholarship. But strip away the sensationalism, and you're left with a genuine mystery. Why create art for an audience that doesn't exist? The Nazca themselves left no written records explaining the lines. No oral traditions survived the Spanish conquest. The local people in the 1500s had no idea who built the lines or why. The knowledge was already lost. What we do know, the Nazca lines required extensive planning and organization. Creating a design visible only from the air means someone had to conceive the entire image, scale it up dramatically, and direct teams of workers to execute it with precision, all while never seeing the final result themselves. It's an act of faith, or an act of communication with something they believed was watching. The lines have survived for over 1,000 years, protected by the desert's stable climate. But modern threats are closing in: vehicle tracks, foot traffic, urban expansion. In 2014, Greenpeace activists walked onto the site to place a banner, leaving footprints near the hummingbird that may be permanent. The Nazca created something meant to last forever, meant to be seen from above, meant to communicate something we can no longer understand. A message carved into the earth itself, preserved by accident, lost to meaning. They built for the sky, for eyes we can't see, for reasons we can't know. And the question remains, who were they trying to reach? Deep in the Dendera temple complex in Egypt, about 300 miles south of Cairo, there's a chamber few tourists see. It's not grand like the main hall with its astronomical ceiling. It's not sacred like the inner sanctum. It's a side room, almost forgotten, carved with reliefs that shouldn't exist. The reliefs show something that looks impossibly like a light bulb. Two large objects dominate the carvings, elongated oval shapes with internal serpents extending from one end. The bulbs rest on pillars that look remarkably like insulators. Braided cables connect them to box-like objects. Figures stand nearby, apparently operating or worshipping the devices. The image is repeated in multiple reliefs from slightly different angles with this consistent details. The official explanation is straightforward. These are lotus flowers. The serpent inside represents the primordial snake emerging from the flower of creation. It's all symbolic. Religious mythology. The Egyptians weren't depicting technology, they were depicting cosmology. Except, lotus flowers don't have cables, they don't rest on insulators. And when you paint the lines with gold during certain ceremonies, they don't illuminate the chamber. But that's exactly what some researchers claim was the purpose. The reliefs date to the Ptolemaic period, around 50 BCE. By this time, Egypt had been building temples for 3,000 years. They knew how to carve symbolic representations of flowers. They did it constantly. and those carvings look nothing like the Dendera reliefs. Here's what makes skeptics uncomfortable. Ancient Egyptians built temple chambers with no windows, no openings, no source of natural light. Yet the walls are covered with intricate reliefs and hieroglyphs. How did artisans see to carve them? The standard answer is torches or oil lamps. But there's a problem: no soot deposits on the ceilings. In confined spaces, torches and oil lamps create thick black soot that stains stone. Egyptian tombs are often black with it. But certain chambers, including some at Dendera, have pristine ceilings. White limestone, no darkening, no residue. Something lit those spaces that didn't produce smoke. Engineers examining the reliefs have noted the resemblance to Crookes tubes, early cathode ray tubes invented in the 1870s. The shape is similar. The apparent power source is similar. The serpent inside could represent the electrical discharge visible in such tubes. Is it possible the Egyptians had electricity? If they had the Baghdad battery, is it so impossible they scaled it up? Copper was abundant. They had the metallurgical knowledge. They understood chemistry well enough to create the most sophisticated embalming process in the ancient world. But where are the other artifacts? Where are the wires, the generators, the infrastructure? If the Egyptians had electric light, there should be evidence everywhere. Instead, we have one chamber, one set of reliefs, and 1,000 years of silence. Unless it was lost. Unless the knowledge was held by a small group, priests perhaps, guardians of sacred technology. When those priests died without passing on their secrets, when the temples were abandoned, when Egypt fell to Persian, Greek, then Roman rule, the knowledge evaporated. What remained were the carvings, their meaning forgotten, reinterpreted as mythology by later generations, who couldn't imagine their ancestors had possessed such technology. The Dendera temple also contains the famous Dendera zodiac, a bas-relief showing the zodiacal constellations with stunning astronomical precision. The Egyptians who built this temple were sophisticated scientists. They calculated the length of the year to within minutes of the true solar year. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes. They weren't primitive. So when they carved what looks like a light bulb, complete with power source and cables, maybe, just maybe, they were depicting exactly what it looks like. The chamber exists. You can visit it. You can stand in the darkness and look at the reliefs and try to convince yourself they're lotus flowers. The shadows cast by your flashlight will dance across the carvings, and for a moment, in the flickering light, they might look alive, almost illuminated from within. The guides will tell you it's mythology, symbolism, ancient religious beliefs. But the carvings remain, stubbornly technological, impossibly modern, waiting in the darkness. The Great Sphinx of Giza squats in the desert, half buried by sand for most of its existence, carved from a single limestone outcrop. Official history says Pharaoh Khafra built it around 2500 BCE as a guardian for his pyramid, a lion's body, a pharaoh's head. Standard Egyptian symbology. Except nothing about the Sphinx is standard. In the 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch examined the weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure and concluded that the erosion was caused by water, not wind. Deep vertical fissures consistent with rainfall. Heavy rainfall. The kind of rainfall that hasn't occurred in Egypt for at least 5,000 years, which would place the Sphinx's construction well before the accepted date, possibly before Egyptian civilization as we know it. But let's set aside the dating controversy. Let's talk about what's beneath it. In 1987, a Japanese team from Waseda University conducted electromagnetic surveys around the Sphinx. They detected cavities, multiple cavities, beneath the paws, behind the structure, under the causeway. Not natural fissures. These were too regular, too defined. Chambers. Additional surveys using seismic equipment confirmed it. There are hollow spaces beneath the Sphinx, room-sized voids in the bedrock, and they appear to be artificial. The Egyptian authorities acknowledged one chamber, a small vertical shaft between the Sphinx's paws, about 30 feet deep, that was explored in the 1920s and found to contain nothing. Empty. Which is itself strange. Why dig a shaft 30 feet into solid rock and leave it empty? But the geophysical surveys suggest larger chambers, much larger, and they haven't been opened. After initial excitement in the 1990s, the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities shut down further investigation. No more surveys, no more drilling. The matter was closed. Why? The official reason is preservation. The Sphinx is fragile. It's been restored multiple times. Drilling could damage it. All reasonable concerns. But researchers who've worked in Egypt tell a different story. They describe resistance from authorities, permits denied, equipment confiscated. The Egyptian government has been extremely protective of the Sphinx, more so than other monuments, as if they know something is down there and don't want it found. Ancient texts add fuel to the fire. Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BCE, mentions underground chambers beneath the pyramids and Sphinx, built by the original architects. The inventory stela, a controversial artifact from the 26th dynasty, suggests the Sphinx already existed when Khufu built his pyramid, making it far older than orthodox archaeology accepts. Edgar Cayce, the American mystic, claimed in the 1930s that a hall of records was buried beneath the Sphinx, containing the lost knowledge of Atlantis. Easy to dismiss as pseudoscience, except Cayce's prediction was made before any surveys detected chambers. He said they were there, and they are. What could be in those? Chambers? Best case, nothing. Empty rooms, natural cavities. Worst case, evidence that rewrites Egyptian history. Artifacts that predate the accepted timeline. Knowledge from a civilization that isn't supposed to exist. Here's the thing about hidden chambers. Once they're opened, you can't close them again. Once the knowledge is out, it's out. And if what's down there contradicts the established narrative of human history, if it suggests that the Sphinx is thousands of years older than believed, built by people who aren't in our textbooks, then everything changes. Better to leave it sealed. Better to deny the surveys. Better to insist the erosion is wind-caused, that the dating is solid, that the chambers don't exist or are unimportant. The Sphinx has guarded its secrets for millennia. It's not giving them up easily, but the chambers are there. The seismic data is conclusive. Something is beneath the pause, and someone, sometime, will open them. The question is, what will we find, and will we be ready for the answer? Crete, 1908. Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier is excavating the Minoan palace of Phaistos when he uncovers something extraordinary, a disc of fired clay, about 6 inches in diameter, covered on both sides with stamped symbols arranged in a spiral pattern. The symbols are crisp, clear, obviously made with carved seals pressed into soft clay before firing. There are 242 symbols total, representing 45 distinct signs. Pictograms, a man running. A woman with elaborate hair, a fish, a bird, a ship, a flower, tools and weapons. Each symbol carefully placed, spiraling from the edge to the center. It looks like writing. It has the structure of writing, repeated symbols, apparent word divisions, grammatical patterns. But nobody can read it, not for lack of trying. Linguists have spent over a century attempting to decipher the Phaistos disc. They've compared it to every known ancient script. Linear A and Linear B, other Cretan scripts, hieroglyphics, Phoenician, Proto-Sinaitic, Anatolian scripts. No matches, no similarities, no linguistic relatives. The symbols don't appear anywhere else. No other artifacts bear this script. No inscriptions on walls, no clay tablets. Just this one disc, fired and perfect, a complete mystery. Theories abound. It's a prayer, a hymn, a story, a calendar, a board game, a forgery. That last theory gained traction because the disc is so unique, so perfectly preserved, so conveniently anomalous. Maybe Pernier faked it for fame. Except, the clay is genuine Minoan clay. The disc was found in an undisturbed archaeological layer dated to 1700 BCE. The firing technique matches other Minoan pottery. Every test confirms authenticity. So, we're left with a genuine artifact bearing a script that appears nowhere else in the archaeological record. A script that was sophisticated enough to use individual stamps for each symbol, implying movable type, a technology that wouldn't appear in Europe for another 3,000 years. The stamps themselves have never been found. No workshop. No other examples of their use. Just the disc. Some researchers suggest it's not from Crete at all. The symbols include images not found in Minoan art, the feathered headdress, certain architectural elements, the particular style of ship. Maybe the disc came from elsewhere, carried to Crete by traders or refugees, a message from a civilization we've lost all other record of. The spiral arrangement suggests it was meant to be read from the outside in, or possibly from the inside out. But which direction and in what language? Attempts to map the symbols to Greek, Phoenician, or other Mediterranean languages have failed. The grammar doesn't match, the structure is wrong. What if it's not a language at all, but a code? Some have suggested the symbols represent musical notation, astronomical data, or mathematical concepts. The repeated patterns could be formulas. The sequences could be calculations. Without a key, without context, we're blind. The Phaistos disc sits in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum in Crete, behind glass, endlessly studied and endlessly mysterious. Tourists photograph it, scholars debate it. Amateur cryptographers post theories online. Nothing sticks. Here's what haunts me. Someone made this. Someone stamped these symbols in careful spirals, fired the clay, and used the disc for something. It had a purpose. It conveyed meaning. To the person who made it, this wasn't a mystery. It was information. And then the knowledge of how to read it vanished. The stamps were lost or destroyed. The language fell out of use. The people who could interpret it died without passing on the skill, maybe catastrophically. The Minoans were devastated by the eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE. Maybe gradually, languages die when cultures are conquered, absorbed, erased. Either way, the disc remains. A message we can't read, knowledge we can't access. A voice from 3,700 years ago speaking clearly that we can no longer understand. It's a reminder that loss isn't always dramatic. Sometimes knowledge just fades. The last person who remembers dies. The final student never finds a teacher. The tradition ends. And what remains is silence. Beautiful, intricate, incomprehensible silence. Qumran, 1947. A Bedouin shepherd boy tosses a rock into a cave and hears something shatter. Investigating, he discovers clay jars containing scrolls, leather and papyrus wrapped in linen, hidden in the darkness for nearly 2,000 years. Over the next decade, 11 caves yielded approximately 900 documents, biblical texts, commentaries, prayers, community rules. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest surviving manuscripts of biblical texts, dating from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. The official narrative is controlled and careful. These are ancient biblical manuscripts that confirm the accuracy of modern biblical texts. They're important for understanding ancient Judaism. They provide context for the time of Jesus, valuable but not revolutionary. That's a lie by omission. Because among the fragments are texts that didn't make it into the Bible, books that were deliberately excluded, gospels that were suppressed, theological ideas that early church authorities wanted erased. The War Scroll describes an apocalyptic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The community rule outlines the practices of a Jewish sect, possibly the Essenes, who rejected the temple priesthood in Jerusalem, considering them corrupt. These weren't fringe believers. They were organized, literate, numerous enough to maintain a community at Qumran for generations. But here's where it gets dark. The scrolls include portions of books like Enoch and Jubilees, texts that were popular in early Judaism and early Christianity, but were later excluded from the biblical canon. Why? Because they contained uncomfortable ideas. Enoch describes angels interbreeding with humans, creating giants. It names the angels, describes their sins, details their punishment. This mythology was too weird, too pagan-sounding for later religious authorities. So Enoch was scrubbed from official scripture. Except it wasn't completely lost. Ethiopian Orthodox Christians preserved it. And now the Dead Sea Scrolls prove it was widely read in ancient times. The ideas that seem strange to us were mainstream belief for ancient Jews. The scrolls also complicate the story of Jesus. They reveal a diverse, fractured Judaism in the 1st century CE. Multiple competing sects, different messianic expectations, varied interpretations of Scripture. The Christianity that emerged wasn't a clean break from Judaism. It was one branch of an already splintered tree. And here's where the suppression begins. After their discovery, the scrolls were controlled by a small team of scholars, mostly Christians, mostly men. affiliated with religious institutions. For decades, they controlled access. They decided which fragments to publish and when. They interpreted the texts through a lens that minimized their challenge to Orthodox Christianity. Critics accused the team of deliberately slow publication to suppress uncomfortable revelations. Fragments that mentioned James the Just, Jesus' brother, or questioned the divinity of Christ, or contradicted New Testament accounts. These were held back, studied in private, their implications debated behind closed doors. It wasn't until the 1990s, when the monopoly was broken and the scrolls were fully published and digitized, that independent scholars could assess them, and the full picture emerged. Ancient Judaism was weirder than we'd been taught. Early Christianity was more diverse than church history admits. The texts that became the Bible were chosen deliberately, and many texts were rejected for theological reasons, not because they were less authentic. The Damascus document, found among the scrolls, describes a teacher of righteousness, opposed by a wicked priest. Who were these figures? Some scholars see parallels to John the Baptist and the Jewish authorities. Others suggest Jesus and the Pharisees. The text is deliberately cryptic, names obscured, events encoded. Why write this way unless you feared persecution? Unless you knew your texts might be found by the wrong people? The community at Qumran hid the scrolls around 70 CE, when Roman legions destroyed Jerusalem. They placed them in jars, sealed the caves, and either died or fled. They never came back. The knowledge they preserved, their interpretations, their beliefs, their alternate versions of sacred texts, was lost for 100 years. And when it was found, powerful institutions tried to control it, to manage the narrative, to ensure that what emerged didn't shatter too many established beliefs. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that early religious history was messier, more contested, more deliberately edited than we've been told. Texts were chosen, others were rejected, beliefs were standardized, and dissenters were erased. The scrolls survived by accident, hidden in caves, preserved by desert dryness, rediscovered by chance. What else is still hidden? The gold death masks of Egyptian pharaohs are among the most iconic artifacts in archaeology. Tutankhamun's mask, gleaming gold, lapis lazuli inlays, that serene face staring into eternity, has become the symbol of ancient Egypt itself. We're told they're funerary objects. Beautiful, yes, valuable, certainly, but ultimately decorative. Placed on the mummy to protect the deceased's face, to ensure they'd be recognized in the afterlife. That's the sanitized version. The masks weren't just memorial portraits. They were ritual tools, devices used in practices we'd find deeply disturbing, because the ancient Egyptians didn't view death the way we do. To them, death was a transition. And that transition could be controlled. The Egyptian concept of the soul was complex. Multiple components including the Ka, life force, the Ba, personality, and the Akh, the transformed spirit. Death separated these elements. Proper burial rites reunited them. But there were other rituals, secret practices, ceremonies that the common people never knew about. The gold masks served a specific purpose in these rites. They captured the essence of the deceased. The face, rendered in imperishable gold, became a vessel for the Ka. But more than that, the masks could be used to transfer power. Here's where it gets dark. Ancient texts describe rituals where a new pharaoh would commune with the mask of his predecessor, absorbing their wisdom, their authority, their very essence. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed on both mummies and statues, was supposed to reanimate the dead, allowing them to speak, to eat, to act in the afterlife. But some texts suggest the ritual did more. By placing the mask on a living person, by performing the correct invocations, the soul of the deceased could be called forth, channeled, even transferred. The mask of Tutankhamun weighs 22 pounds, solid gold. It's not comfortable to wear, but hieroglyphic inscriptions on the back contain spells, protective incantations, yes, but also invocations that address the mask itself as if it were alive. You who are gold, you who are eternal, speak for the king in the council of gods. Other masks have been found with more explicit instructions. The mask of Susenes the Firm, discovered at Tanis, contains interior inscriptions, text that would only be visible to someone wearing it, spells meant to be spoken from within the mask, merging the speaker's identity with the deceased. This wasn't just symbolism, The Egyptians believed these rituals worked. They invested enormous resources, gold, lapis, craftsmanship, into creating masks that could serve as bridges between life and death. And there's evidence it wasn't limited to pharaohs. Wealthy nobles commissioned golden masks. Priests had their own versions. A hierarchy of death technology, concentrated at the top of society, where the knowledge and resources existed to attempt what we'd now consider impossible: immortality through transference. The practice appears in other cultures too. Roman death masks, Mesoamerican jade masks, the mask of Agamemnon in Greece. Different civilizations, same idea. Preserve the face in imperishable material, and you preserve the soul. But the Egyptian masks are different. They're not just preservation, they're tools. Active devices and rituals we no longer fully understand because the detailed instructions were oral tradition, passed from priest to priest, lost when the temples closed and the priesthood ended. What we have are fragments, tomb paintings showing masked figures in ceremonies, papyri with truncated spells, archaeological evidence of masks being moved between burials, used repeatedly. But the full rituals? Gone. The Museum of Egyptian Antiquities in Cairo houses dozens of golden masks. Tourists photograph them. Tour guides explain their beauty, their craftsmanship, their historical value. Nobody mentions that these were instruments of power, that pharaohs commissioned them not just to look good in death, but to maintain control beyond it. That the masks were gateways, allowing the deceased to influence, advise, even inhabit the living. Modern magicians and occultists understand this. They study the inscriptions, recreate the ceremonies. Whether anything happens is debatable, but the Egyptians believed, and they were neither stupid nor superstitious. They were sophisticated scientists who mapped the stars, built impossible monuments, and developed medical techniques that wouldn't be replicated for millennia. If they believed these masks were functional devices for consciousness transfer, maybe we should take that seriously. The masks remain. Gold doesn't tarnish, doesn't decay, doesn't forget. And behind the glass, in the silent museums, those golden faces stare out at us with ancient eyes, waiting. The Rosetta Stone is famous for what it unlocked: the ability to read Egyptian hieroglyphs after centuries of illiteracy. Found in 1799 by French soldiers in the town of Rashid, Rosetta, the stone bears the same decree in 3 scripts: ancient Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphics. Jean-François Champollion used the Greek text as a key, cracking the hieroglyphic code in 1822, a triumph of scholarship, a door open to understanding ancient Egypt, the story they teach in schools. But what they don't tell you is what else might be encoded in those hieroglyphs. The decree itself is mundane, a tax exemption for priests issued by Ptolemy V in 196 BCE. Standard bureaucratic stuff. But look closer at the hieroglyphics section. Certain symbols appear with strange frequency. Patterns emerge that don't match the Greek or Demotic versions exactly. See, translation isn't one-to-one. Languages have different structures, different idioms. When you translate, you convey meaning, not literal words. The 3 versions on the Rosetta Stone should say the same thing conceptually, but the exact wording varies. And in those variations, some researchers have found something disturbing. The hieroglyphic version contains extra information, phrases that don't appear in the Greek, symbols that seem decorative but might be mnemonic devices or coded messages for initiated readers. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs weren't just a writing system. They were sacred. The word hieroglyph literally means sacred carvings. Literacy was restricted. Scribes underwent years of training. The knowledge wasn't democratized, it was controlled. And within that controlled system, there were layers: public writing that anyone literate could read, and temple writing, hidden texts, encoded meanings known only to high priests. The Egyptians had secrets within secrets. The Rosetta Stone was commissioned during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers controlled Egypt. The Greek section is straightforward. It's meant for Greek-speaking administrators. But the hieroglyphic section, that was for Egyptian priests, the old guard, the keepers of traditions that predated Greek rule by thousands of years. What if they embedded messages in the hieroglyphs, not contradicting the decree but adding context, warnings, encoded history, information they wanted preserved but not accessible to the foreign rulers? modern Egyptologists dismiss this. They say the translation is consistent, that any variations are stylistic. But cryptographers who've examined the stone point out that ancient scribes were sophisticated. They used acrostics, number codes, symbol substitutions. The Greeks and Romans did it. Why not the Egyptians? Consider, the Rosetta Stone is one of the most studied artifacts in history. It's been photographed, scanned, analyzed with every modern technique, and we're still finding new details. In 2015, high-resolution imaging revealed faint inscriptions on the sides, texts that had been missed for over 2 centuries. Additional decrees, more context. What else haven't we found? There's a reason Egypt's priesthood was so powerful, so secretive, so enduring across millennia. They controlled knowledge. They were astronomers, physicians, mathematicians, historians. And they wrote everything down, but not for public consumption. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, when the Ptolemies took over, when Rome absorbed it all, the priests adapted. They served the new rulers, but they kept their secrets. The innermost temple chambers remained closed to foreigners. The deepest knowledge stayed protected. And then Christianity came. The temples were shut down. The old religion was outlawed. By the 4th century CE, the last people who could read hieroglyphs were dying. The knowledge evaporated within a single generation. Was it accidental, or was it deliberately killed? Did early Christians recognize that those symbols contained power, knowledge, ideas that contradicted their theology? Did they systematically erase the ability to read Egyptian texts to ensure those ideas died? For 1,400 years, nobody could read hieroglyphs. The Rosetta Stone gave us that ability back, but we're reading with fresh eyes, without the context, without the oral traditions that explain the hidden meanings. We're like children who found the alphabet, but don't understand that words can have multiple meanings, that texts can contain layers, that the same symbols can convey different truths depending on who's reading. The Rosetta Stone sits in the British Museum, one of their most prized possessions. Egypt has repeatedly demanded its return. The British refuse. Colonial theft, obviously. But there's another angle. Whoever controls the Rosetta Stone controls the narrative of Egyptian translation. If the stone went back to Egypt, Egyptian scholars would have unrestricted access. They might find things British Egyptologists missed or chose not to publish. The stone is a key. But what if it's also a lock? What if the secrets weren't meant to be discovered by outsiders? What if the priests who carved it knew that someday, centuries later, someone would use it to break the code, but they embedded warnings, puzzles, traps for the unprepared? The hieroglyphs are beautiful, but beauty can hide thorns. They're the most recognizable structures on Earth. The Great Pyramid, Khufu's tomb, built around 2560 BCE, stood as the tallest human-made structure for 3,800 years. Over 2 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. Some blocks weigh 80 tons. The precision is absurd. The base is level to within 2.1 centimeters. The sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, accurate to 0.067 degrees. We're told they're tombs, just very fancy tombs. Pharaohs built them as eternal resting places, monuments to their own power, stairways to the stars. Except no mummy has ever been found in the Great Pyramid, no burial goods, no hieroglyphics inside identifying Khufu or explaining the pyramid's purpose. The sarcophagus in the king's chamber is undecorated, unfinished, and too large to have been brought in through the passageways, meaning it was installed during construction, not after. What if they were never tombs at all? Recent research suggests the pyramids may have been machines, power plants even. The theory sounds like pseudoscience until you examine the evidence. The Great Pyramid was originally covered in smooth white limestone casing stones, polished to reflect light. The capstone, now missing, may have been electrum, gold and silver alloy, a perfect conductor. The interior chambers contain shafts that align with specific stars. The king's chamber is constructed from red granite blocks quarried from Aswan, 500 miles away. Granite contains high concentrations of quartz crystal. Quartz is piezoelectric. It generates electricity when under pressure. The weight of the pyramid puts enormous pressure on the granite in the king's chamber. Could this have generated an electrical field? The pyramid sits over an underground water source, natural aquifers that flow beneath the Giza Plateau. Water moving through limestone generates an electrical charge through hydroelectricity. The shafts and passageways could have acted as waveguides, conducting electromagnetic frequencies. Christopher Dunn, an engineer, proposed that the Great Pyramid was a hydrogen power plant. The chemical reactions in the Queen's Chamber, which shows evidence of chemical residue, could have generated hydrogen gas. The ascending passageway channeled acoustical vibrations. The Grand Gallery acted as a resonator. The entire structure was tuned to a specific frequency. Sound crazy? The ancient historian Herodotus wrote that the pyramid gleamed and produced strange sounds during certain times of day. Arab texts from the Middle Ages describe the pyramids humming at night. Local legends speak of the pyramids glowing. In the 1930s, explorers entering the pyramid reported strange electrical phenomena, compass needles spinning, cameras malfunctioning, a tingling sensation on the skin, dismissed as imagination or electromagnetic fields from modern equipment. But what if the pyramid was still working, even partially? The three pyramids of Giza align with Orion's belt, a correlation that's astronomically precise. They also align with the Earth's magnetic field. The Giza Plateau itself is one of the most magnetically powerful points on the planet. And then there's the air shafts. The shafts in the King's Chamber are labeled as air vents, except they don't vent to the outside. They're blocked. One shaft was recently explored using a robot. At the end is a small door with copper handles. Copper, a conductor. Behind the door, nobody knows. The Egyptian authorities stopped the exploration. Why build something so enormous, so precise, so expensive if it's just a tomb? The pharaohs who came after Khufu tried to replicate the pyramids. They failed. The later pyramids are smaller, cruder, made with inferior materials. Within a few centuries, the knowledge of how to build a true pyramid was lost. Or was it suppressed? Consider, if the Great Pyramid was functional technology, not a tomb, then it represented power, real power, not political or religious, actual electrical power. Whoever controlled it controlled energy itself. When the pyramid's casing stones were stripped away, mostly during the Middle Ages to build Cairo, the machine stopped working. The smooth surface was essential. Without it, the pyramid became inert, just a pile of rocks. Convenient, right? Destroy the functionality, preserve the structure, let people think it was always just a tomb. Modern Egypt doesn't want this theory explored. The pyramids are cultural treasures, symbols of ancient Egyptian civilization. Reframing them as machines built by a lost technological society complicates the narrative. It raises uncomfortable questions about who really built them and what knowledge was lost. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed cavities inside the Great Pyramid, spaces that aren't on any map. When scientists requested permission to explore them, the requests were denied. Preservation concerns, they are told, or perhaps, we don't want you to find what's actually in there. The pyramids stand, silent, stripped of their casing stones, no longer glowing, no longer humming, no longer generating whatever it was they generated. But the machine remains, dormant, waiting for someone to understand its purpose and flip the switch. The Maya didn't just track time, they understood it in ways we're only beginning to comprehend. Their long count calendar doesn't measure time in simple years. It measures it in cycles, nested wheels within wheels, overlapping rhythms that track not just days but astronomical alignments spanning millennia. The calendar accounts for the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cycle. It predicts solar eclipses centuries in advance. It marks the galactic alignment of the winter solstice sun with the dark rift of the Milky Way, an event that occurs once every 26,000 years and happened in 2012. Yes, that 2012. The end of the world nonsense obscured something real. The Maya calculated cosmic cycles with precision that rivals modern astronomy, without telescopes, without computers, using observation, mathematics, and stone. The calendar system uses multiple interlocking cycles: the 260-day Tzolk'in, the 365-day Hab, the 52-year calendar round, and the long count, spanning 5,125 years. These cycles intersect, creating unique dates that won't repeat for millions of years. It's not just timekeeping, it's time mapping on a cosmic scale. How did they do this? The Maya were obsessed with Venus. They tracked its synodic period, the time it takes to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun, to within minutes of the true value. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Mayan books, contains Venus tables predicting its movements for centuries. They knew Mercury's orbit, Mars's cycle, Jupiter's rhythm. They charted them all, carved the data into stone monuments, built entire temple complexes oriented to astronomical events. And here's the thing that keeps astronomers awake at night. Some of the cycles the Maya tracked are only visible with long-term observation. We're talking centuries of data collection, consistent, methodical, precise. The Maya would have needed continuous observation for at least 1,000 years to achieve the accuracy found in their calendars. But Mayan civilization as we know it, the classic period, only lasted about 600 years from 250 to 900 CE. Where did they get the older data? The answer, they inherited it. The calendar system predates the Maya. Earlier Mesoamerican cultures, the Olmec, the Zapotec, used similar systems. The Maya refined it, perfected it, but didn't invent it, which means the astronomical observations go back even further. Perhaps 2,000 years, perhaps more. Someone, long before the Maya rose to power, was watching the skies with meticulous care, recording data, calculating cycles, building a model of cosmic time so sophisticated that it's still accurate today. And then, that knowledge was passed down, generation after generation, protected by a priestly class who understood its importance even if they no longer fully understood its origins. When the Spanish conquered the Maya in the 16th century, they destroyed the calendar system. Diego de Landa, a Franciscan friar, personally burned hundreds of Mayan books. He called them works of the devil. Only 4 codices survived. The knowledge might have been lost forever, except it was carved in stone. Monuments, stelae, temple walls. The Spanish couldn't destroy all of it, and slowly, painstakingly, epigraphers have reconstructed the calendar. But here's the disturbing part. The long count calendar didn't just track time, it tracked apocalypses. The Maya believed history moved in cycles. At the end of each cycle, the world would be destroyed and recreated. We're currently in the 4th world. 3 previous worlds existed and ended catastrophically. The calendar marks these transitions. Mythology? Perhaps. But the Maya were scientists. If they believed in cyclic destruction, they had reasons. They'd observed patterns, astronomical alignments correlated with earthly catastrophes, solar flares, climate shifts, magnetic pole reversals. Modern astronomy has confirmed that the galaxy has bad neighborhoods, regions of space where star density increases radiation, where gravitational anomalies disrupt planetary orbits. Earth passes through these regions on a cycle, a long cycle, the same cycle the Maya tracked. The 2012 date wasn't an end, it was a transition point, the calendar reset. A new cycle began. What that means, the Maya never explicitly stated. Or if they did, that knowledge burned with the codices. What survives are fragments. Prophecies of change, references to cosmic alignments, warnings carved in stone that we can't fully interpret because the context is gone. The calendar continues. It's still running, still accurate. Mayan communities still use it for ceremony and agriculture. They plant according to its cycles, harvest according to its signs. And sometimes, the old ones, the descendants of the priests who kept this knowledge alive despite conquest, forced conversion, and genocide, sometimes they whisper that the calendar holds more than dates. It holds warnings, predictions, knowledge of cycles that govern more than planetary orbits, cycles of consciousness, cycles of civilization, rise and fall encoded in stone. The Maya saw time differently than we do, not linear, cyclical, not progressive, rhythmic. And in those rhythms, they found meaning, patterns, inevitabilities. The stone monuments remain scattered across Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, Honduras. The Spanish couldn't destroy them all. The jungle couldn't swallow them all. And the calendar runs on, counting days toward what the Maya knew, or they thought they knew. Now, we can only calculate the cycles and wonder what happens when they complete. Central China, 1974. Farmers digging a well uncover something impossible. Life-size terracotta warriors, buried in formation, facing east as if ready for battle. Within months, archaeologists realized the scale. Thousands of warriors, each with unique features, accompanied by horses, chariots, and weapons. An army built to serve China's first emperor in the afterlife. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCA. He was brutal, paranoid, obsessed with immortality. He unified China, standardized weights and measures, built the Great Wall. He also buried scholars alive, burned books, and forced hundreds of thousands into labor on his tomb. The terracotta army is spectacular, but it's just the outer perimeter. The actual tomb, the emperor's burial chamber, lies beneath a massive earthen pyramid about a mile away. And it's never been opened. Why? Because historical records describe what's inside, and it's terrifying. Sima Qian, writing a century after Qin's death, describes the tomb chamber, a full-scale model of the emperor's realm. Rivers of mercury representing the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, flowing mechanically through the chamber. A ceiling decorated with pearls representing stars and constellations. Crossbow traps set to fire automatically at intruders. And the bodies. Oh, the bodies. When Qin was entombed, his concubines, any who hadn't borne children, were buried alive with him. Estimates range from dozens to hundreds. The workers who built the tomb, who knew its layout and traps, were sealed inside when the construction was complete. No one who knew the tomb's secrets was allowed to survive. Ground-penetrating radar and core samples confirm parts of Sima Qian's account. There are high concentrations of mercury in the soil around the burial chamber, consistent with lakes or rivers of liquid mercury. The tomb contains architectural features suggesting buildings, roads, a miniature empire underground. But the Chinese government refuses to excavate. Official reason? Preservation. The technology doesn't exist to properly conserve what's inside. Opening the tomb could destroy irreplaceable artifacts. Maybe. Or maybe they know what's down there and don't want it publicized. Because mercury isn't just decorative. In high concentrations, it's a poison, a neurotoxin. Workers who built the tomb were likely exposed to fatal levels. The tomb itself is toxic. Anyone who enters without proper equipment would be breathing vaporized mercury. Death would be slow, painful, and certain. Qin deliberately poisoned his tomb, not just with traps, but with the environment itself. He wanted his rest to be eternal and undisturbed. The mercury guaranteed it. But there's more. Ancient texts hint at darker practices. Qin was obsessed with immortality. He sent expeditions to find the elixir of life. He consumed cinnabar, a mercury compound, believing it would grant eternal life. It probably hastened his death. His tomb was meant to be a gateway, not an endpoint. The terracotta army wasn't just for show. It represented his real army, which he might command in the afterlife. The miniature empire was meant to be his actual empire, somehow accessible through death. The craftsmen who made the terracotta warriors gave each one a unique face. Why? Standard soldiers don't need individual features, unless they were meant to represent actual people. Portraits of real soldiers, enslaved in clay, bound to serve the emperor forever. Some of the terracotta figures have been found with traces of organic material, ash, bone fragments, human remains mixed into the clay, as if the figures weren't just representations, but containers, vessels. This gets into territory most archaeologists won't touch publicly, but privately, away from academic papers, some admit the possibility. The terracotta army might have been created through rituals that bound the souls of actual soldiers to the clay figures. Human sacrifice, ritualized and permanent. The tomb is a necropolis, a death city, designed to function in the afterlife with the same bureaucracy, structure, and control that Qin exercised in life. And it might still be working. Local legends describe strange lights near the tomb mound at night. Workers on nearby construction projects report feeling watched. Some refuse to work after dark. The Chinese government dismisses it as superstition, but they've also heavily restricted access to the area. Tourists can see the terracotta warriors in their museum halls. The tomb itself is off limits. Permanently. In 1999, archaeologists discovered another pit near the tomb containing bronze waterfowl, bronze cranes, and bronze musicians, an entire orchestra. The bronze was chemically treated to prevent corrosion. After 2,200 years, it looked nearly new. The level of preservation is extraordinary and disturbing, because if the bronze is that well preserved, what about the organic materials? What about the bodies? What's waiting in that sealed chamber might not be ruins and bones. It might be a perfectly preserved nightmare, an emperor entombed in Mercury, surrounded by the women and workers he murdered in a recreation of his empire that was never meant to decay. The tomb sits under a hill, grass grows on top, birds nest in the trees, and beneath, in absolute darkness, in toxic air, Qin Shi Huang waits. The Chinese government says they'll open the tomb eventually, when the technology is ready, when they can guarantee preservation, or when they're ready for the world to know what's down there. The Vikings navigated across the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, even North America, long before the magnetic compass existed in Europe. In fog, under cloudy skies, without being able to see the sun or stars, they crossed open ocean and made landfall with accuracy that baffles modern sailors. How? Medieval texts reference a Solarstein, sunstone, that Vikings used for navigation. For centuries, historians assumed it was mythological, a magical crystal from a saga, not a real tool. Then, in 2013, archaeologists excavating an Elizabethan shipwreck found a piece of Icelandic spar, calcite crystal, near navigational instruments. The crystal had properties that made it very useful for navigation. It's strongly birefringent, meaning it splits light into two beams. When you look through Icelandic spar at the sky, even a completely cloudy sky, and rotate it, at certain angles the crystal reveals a polarization pattern, a darkening or brightening of light. This pattern points toward the sun's position. Even when the sun isn't visible, the Vikings, who lacked compasses, could have used these crystals to navigate. By checking the polarization pattern several times a day, they could maintain a consistent heading across open ocean. Experiments confirm it works. Scientists tested Icelandic spar under various conditions, heavy cloud cover, fog, twilight, and found that skilled users could determine the sun's position to within a few degrees, accurate enough for ocean navigation. So, the sagas were right. The sunstone was real. But here's where it gets strange. Understanding light polarization requires an understanding of the wave nature of light. That's advanced physics. The phenomenon wasn't scientifically described until the 19th century. Yet, Vikings in the 9th century not only knew about it, they built navigation technology around it. How? The standard answer: observation and trial and error. They noticed that certain crystals did weird things to light. They experimented. They realized the effect was useful. Maybe. But that implies a level of systematic experimentation and knowledge transmission that we don't usually credit to Viking culture. We think of them as raiders and traders, not scientists. Yet they sailed to North America around the year 1000 CE, 5 centuries before Columbus. They established settlements in Greenland that lasted 450 years. They navigated Arctic waters where magnetic compasses are unreliable due to proximity to the magnetic pole. They must have had sophisticated navigation techniques, techniques that worked, techniques that were reliable enough to risk lives and livelihoods on ocean voyages. The sunstone is one piece, but Viking navigation also incorporated other methods, tracking wave patterns, observing bird flight, noticing watercolor changes that indicated depth or current. They had a holistic understanding of the ocean that modern sailors, dependent on GPS and radar, have lost. And then the Viking Age ended. Christianity spread through Scandinavia. The old ways were suppressed. Pagan practices, including traditional navigation techniques taught by skalds and passed through oral tradition, were discouraged. Within a few generations, the knowledge faded. By the 13th century, the Atlantic voyages had stopped. The Greenland colonies were failing. The North American settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows was long abandoned. The magnetic compass reached Europe from China in the 12th century. Better technology replaced the sunstone. Except the compass has a problem. It points to magnetic north, not true north. In high latitudes, the difference is significant. Viking sunstone navigation might have been more accurate, but it was forgotten. The crystals were left in ships, unrecognized. The sagas that mention them were dismissed as fantasy. The idea that Vikings could navigate using optical properties of crystals seemed too advanced, too scientific. Only after modern physics understood polarization could we recognize what the Vikings had discovered empirically 1,000 years earlier. It's a pattern. Ancient peoples develop sophisticated techniques. The techniques work, then the knowledge is lost through conquest, cultural change, or replacement by newer methods. Centuries later, we rediscover the principles and realize the ancients knew more than we gave them credit for. The Vikings navigated by reading light itself. They turned crystals into tools of precision. They crossed oceans in open boats and made landfall where they intended. And then, we forgot they could do it. We told ourselves they were lucky, that their voyages were desperate, that they stumbled onto North America by accident. The Sunstone says otherwise. It says the Vikings knew exactly what they were doing, and it makes you wonder, what other knowledge did they have? What other techniques, tools, methods did they develop that we've lost or dismissed as impossible? The crystals remain. Icelandic spar is still mined. Tourists buy polished pieces as souvenirs, unaware they're holding navigation technology that guided longships across the North Atlantic. The Vikings knew. They sailed by polarized light, by wave patterns, by the flight of ravens. They read the ocean like a book, and we forgot how to read it. They shouldn't exist. Artifacts found on opposite sides of the world, South America, Egypt, Southeast Asia, the Mediterranean, bearing impossible similarities, not stylistic coincidences, not parallel development, identical designs, identical symbols, identical technologies that suggest a common source, a source that isn't in our history books. Start with the pyramids. Egypt has them. Everyone knows that. But so does Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, Indonesia, China, Bosnia. Yes, Bosnia has what might be pyramids, though that's hotly contested. Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt. The structures appear on nearly every continent, built by cultures that supposedly never contacted each other. Standard explanation? Pyramids are a natural architectural form. Stable, monumental, achievable with primitive tools. Convergent evolution, but for buildings. Different cultures independently arrived at the same solution. Fine. Except, the pyramids aren't just similar in shape. Some have identical astronomical alignments. The Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan aligns with the Pleiades, just like the Great Pyramid. The Bosnian Pyramid complex, if genuine, aligns with cosmic north with greater accuracy than Giza. Then there are the gods, bearded white gods appearing in the mythology of cultures that had no contact. Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Viracocha in Peru, both described as bearded, pale-skinned teachers who arrived from across the sea, taught advanced knowledge, then departed with promises to return. Indigenous Americans don't typically have beards. The genes for substantial facial hair aren't common in pre-Columbian populations. So, who were these bearded visitors? The artifacts get more specific. In 1929, a temple map was discovered in Keiko in Japan, a map of the world dated to approximately 1000 BCE. It shows continents in accurate proportion. It shows the Americas labeled as Land of the Gods. This predates Columbus by 2,500 years. Cocaine and tobacco have been found in Egyptian mummies. Cocaine comes from South American coca plants. Tobacco is native to the Americas. These plants didn't exist in Africa or Europe before Columbus, yet chemical analysis confirms their presence in mummies dated to 1000 BCE. The official response? Contamination. Modern contamination. Except the mummies have been kept in sealed environments, and multiple mummies show the same compounds. And the testing has been repeated by independent labs. Someone was crossing the Atlantic, regularly, long before history says it was possible. Then there's the metalworking. Bronze Age cultures in the Mediterranean required tin to make bronze. Tin deposits in the Mediterranean are limited, but bronze production exploded during certain periods. Where did the tin come from? Cornwall, England has tin. So does Bolivia. Chemical analysis of bronze artifacts from the Mediterranean shows isotopic signatures matching Bolivian tin. That means metal was being transported across the Atlantic, processed, and distributed through ancient trade networks. This requires infrastructure, ships capable of ocean crossing, navigation techniques, trade agreements between continents, an organized, sophisticated network of exchange, a global civilization, or at least a far more connected ancient world than we've been taught. Plato wrote about Atlantis around 360 BCE. He described it as an advanced naval power that existed 9,000 years before his time, around 9600 BCE. He claimed it was destroyed by a cataclysm, sinking beneath the waves. For centuries, scholars dismissed it as allegory, a philosophical thought experiment. Plato inventing a cautionary tale about hubris. But Plato insisted it was historical. He claimed his source was Solon, who heard the story from Egyptian priests at Say. The priests had records, Plato said, ancient records describing a civilization that predated Egypt itself. What if the priests were right? What if there was a maritime civilization, advanced enough to cross oceans, sophisticated enough to leave architectural and cultural influences worldwide, that existed before recorded history? It wouldn't have been called Atlantis. That's just Plato's Greek name for it. But something existed, some network of trade, knowledge, and technology that spanned the ancient world. And then it ended, catastrophically. Around 11,600 years ago, close to Plato's timeline, the Younger Dryas period ended abruptly. Massive climate change. Sea levels rose by 400 feet in some areas. Coastlines were submerged. Coastal cities, if they existed, would have been drowned. The Black Sea was a freshwater lake. Then the Mediterranean breached the Bosphorus, and salt water flooded in with the force of 200 Niagara Falls. Any settlements around the Black Sea would have been obliterated. This event may be the basis for flood myths found in multiple cultures. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey dates to 9600 BCE, exactly when Plato said Atlantis sank. The site features sophisticated megalithic architecture that predates agriculture, predates pottery, predates everything we thought we knew about the development of civilization. And then it was deliberately buried, filled in with rubble, hidden. Why bury such an advanced site, unless the builders were trying to preserve it, unless they knew a catastrophe was coming? The Atlantean artifacts don't prove Atlantis. They prove something existed that our historical timeline doesn't account for, a level of global connection, technological sophistication, and architectural knowledge that shouldn't exist in the Stone Age. And then it vanished, sunk beneath rising seas, buried by climate catastrophe. Forgotten as survivors scattered, their stories degrading into myths. What we find now are echoes. Pyramid technologies appearing worldwide, navigation techniques that span oceans, metallurgical evidence of impossible trade, genetic anomalies in isolated populations, botanical evidence of transoceanic contact. The pattern is there, scattered across continents, hidden in plain sight, dismissed as coincidence by mainstream archaeology. But it's not coincidence, it's evidence. Evidence that human history is older, stranger, and more connected than we've been taught. The truth wasn't lost. It was drowned. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE at age 32. Poisoning, maybe. Malaria, possibly. Alcohol poisoning, perhaps. The accounts vary, but everyone agrees he died and his body was preserved. His generals fought over the corpse, literally. Control of Alexander's body meant legitimacy, a claim to his empire. Ptolemy the Forbes, who had found the Egyptian Ptolemaic dynasty, hijacked the funeral procession and took the body to Egypt. Initially, Alexander was buried in Memphis. Then, around 280 BCE, Ptolemy the Second moved him to Alexandria, the city Alexander founded. The tomb, the Soma, became a pilgrimage site. Julius Caesar visited. Augustus visited. Cleopatra melted down some of the gold sarcophagus to pay her soldiers. By the 4th century CE, the tomb's location was uncertain. By the 5th century, it was completely lost. The greatest conqueror in history, worshipped as a god, vanished without a trace. How do you lose something that important? Earthquakes hit Alexandria repeatedly. The ancient city sank, literally. Modern Alexandria is built on top of the old city. The royal quarter, where the Soma was located, is underwater. Divers have found massive columns, sphinxes, statues. But no tomb. Some believe Alexander was moved when Christianity took over. The emperor, possibly Theodosius, might have had the pagan shrine destroyed or hidden. Alexander's body could have been secretly relocated and reburied. Others think the tomb is still in Alexandria, buried under centuries of rubble and construction. Ground-penetrating radar has detected anomalies in the royal quarter, large underground structures. But excavation is nearly impossible. Modern buildings sit on top, and the Egyptian government is cautious about destabilizing the city. The wildest theory? Alexander's body is in Venice, in St. Mark's Basilica. The official story says the bones in St. Mark's tomb are the remains of Mark the Evangelist, brought from Alexandria in 828 CE. But the story is suspicious. The Venetian merchants who found Mark's body claim they smuggled it out hidden in a basket of pork to avoid Muslim inspectors. The body was supposedly identified by its smell. It emitted a sweet, pleasant odor, incorruptible flesh, a sign of sainthood, or the sign of a body preserved with techniques far beyond medieval European knowledge. Alexander was mummified using methods that Egyptian priests had perfected over millennia. His body was meant to last forever. Researchers who've examined the St. Mark relics note they're unusually well preserved for bones supposedly 1,800 years old. And the tomb's architecture incorporates Greek and Egyptian elements unusual for a Christian saint's shrine. Could the Venetians have found Alexander, not Mark? Could they have known and deliberately misidentified the body to make it religiously acceptable? If so, why the secrecy? Because Alexander was pagan. He was worshipped as a god. Having his body in a Christian basilica would be blasphemous. But if you called him Mark, suddenly it's acceptable. The evidence is circumstantial. The theory is controversial. But the question remains, where is Alexander? He was too important to simply vanish. His tomb was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world in some lists. Emperors and kings traveled to see it. It contained treasures beyond imagination, gold, jewels, the ceremonial armor of Achilles. Someone knows, or someone knew. The tomb was deliberately hidden, either to protect it from looters or to suppress its pagan associations. Early Christians destroyed countless pagan sites. Books were burned, temples demolished, statues smashed. But some things were too valuable to destroy. They were hidden instead, buried, forgotten, waiting. Alexandria has been excavated for over a century. Major finds are still being made. In 1995, the underwater ruins of Cleopatra's Palace were discovered. In 1998, archaeologists found the lighthouse of Alexandria's ruins. The city keeps revealing its secrets. Alexander's tomb is down there somewhere, underwater, under rubble, under modern streets. A time capsule containing the body of a man who changed the world, whose empire stretched from Greece to India, who died young and was worshipped as divine. The tomb's location may be known to a select few. Archaeologists whisper about discoveries they can't publish, about sites that governments won't allow excavated, about knowledge that's politically or religiously inconvenient. Finding Alexander wouldn't just be an archaeological triumph. It would force confrontations with uncomfortable truths about what was worshipped, about how history was rewritten, about what the early church destroyed and what they hid. Better, perhaps, that Alexander stays lost. A legend, a mystery, untouchable, but the tomb is there, somewhere in Alexandria, in the dark, in the water, in the earth. Between 800 and 1000 CE, swords appeared in northern Europe bearing the inscription Ulfbert. Over 170 have been found, in rivers, in graves, in bogs, scattered across Scandinavia, Germany, France, and Britain. They're Viking swords, except they're made from steel that shouldn't exist for another 800 years. Medieval swords were typically made from bloomery iron, fairly soft, impure, prone to bending. Blacksmiths could harden the edge through carburization, but the overall quality was limited by the iron's impurity, slag inclusions, inconsistent carbon content. These swords were functional, but not exceptional. The Ulfbert swords are different. Metallurgical analysis shows they are made from crucible steel, ultra-high carbon steel with very few impurities. The carbon content is uniform, around 1.0–1.2%. The slag content is almost zero. This type of steel wasn't produced in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The techniques required temperatures of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit and sophisticated metallurgy to remove impurities. Yet someone in the 9th century was making it. Not just one sword, but many. Over the course of 200 years, in consistent quality. The inscription Sulf Bear Sherb Ct might be a maker's mark, though the spelling varies slightly between swords. Some show Psolf Bear Ati Plus, others Psolf Bear Ploati, suggesting multiple smiths using the name, either a brand or a family of craftsmen. Where did they get the steel? One theory, import. Crucible steel, Wootz steel, was produced in India and the Middle East during this period. The Vikings were traders. They traveled the Volga River to Constantinople, traded with the Islamic world. They could have imported raw crucible steel ingots and forged them into swords. But the swords don't match the chemical signature of Indian Wootz, and importing steel would mean the Vikings understood its superior quality and specifically sought it out. That implies sophisticated metallurgical knowledge. Another possibility, a lost European technique. Some blacksmith, somewhere in Northern Europe, discovered or rediscovered how to produce high-quality steel. Perhaps a single innovator, perhaps a small group. They made swords for 2 centuries, guarded their technique carefully, and when they died, the knowledge died with them. Because after 1000 CE, Ulfberht swords disappear. The quality of Viking swords declines. We're back to standard bloomery iron. Whatever process created the Ulfberht swords was lost, or suppressed. The Catholic Church was expanding into Scandinavia during this period. Pagan practices were being stamped out. Traditional knowledge systems, passed down orally through generations of craftsmen, were disrupted as Christianity imposed new social structures. If the Ulfberht technique was associated with paganism, if it was a sacred craft known only to certain smiths who rejected Christianity, the church might have actively destroyed it, killed the smiths, destroyed their workshops, erased the knowledge. We know this happened with other pagan practices. Sacred groves were cut down, runestones were smashed or Christianized, pagan priests were executed or forcibly converted. Entire traditions vanished within a generation. The Ulfberht swords that survive are magnificent. Light, flexible, incredibly hard edges. Modern blacksmiths have tried to recreate them using period-accurate techniques. They struggle. The temperature control required, the knowledge of when to quench and how to fold the metal, the precision needed. It's a dying art even today with modern tools. Imagine doing it with a charcoal forge and hand tools, by eye, by feel, by knowledge passed from master to apprentice over generations. That knowledge is gone. The swords remain as evidence that it existed. And fake Ulfberht swords exist too. Contemporary forgeries from the Viking Age. Lower quality swords bearing the Ulfberht inscription, trying to pass as the real thing. Even 1,000 years ago, the Ulfberht brand was valuable enough to counterfeit. That tells you something. These weren't just weapons, they were status symbols. Tools of war that gave their wielders a genuine advantage. A well-made Ulfberht could cut through inferior swords, through armor, through bone. Vikings who carried Ulfberht swords were marked as elite warriors. The blade declared your status as loudly as any title, and then they stopped being made. The steel was forgotten. The techniques lost. Medieval Europe reverted to inferior metallurgy and wouldn't match Ulfberht quality until the 1700s. 800 years, 8 centuries of metallurgical knowledge lost because, why? Because paganism fell? Because one smith died without passing on the secret? Because the church didn't want weapons they couldn't control? The swords lie in museums now, behind glass, their edges still sharp after 1,000 years. Artifacts from a moment in history when someone, we don't know who, knew more than everyone around them, and took that knowledge to the grave. The Palace of Knossos on Crete is famous for its labyrinthine architecture, its vibrant frescoes, its role as the center of Minoan civilization. The frescoes depict daily life, bull-leaping, religious ceremonies, processions, nature scenes, standard Bronze Age art, except for certain figures that don't quite fit. In the Prince of the Lilies fresco, a figure wears an elaborate feathered headdress, unlike anything else in Minoan art. The anatomy is strange. Elongated limbs, an oddly large cranium. The proportions are off in ways that don't match artistic convention or human anatomy. In other frescoes, particularly those from Akrotiri on Santorini, a Minoan settlement, figures appear with enlarged, almond-shaped eyes, cranial shapes that seem off, not deformed, not diseased, but different, deliberately different. The mainstream interpretation, artistic style, religious symbolism, deities depicted with exaggerated features to show their divine nature. Fair enough, except the Minoans depicted humans quite realistically in other contexts. The Ladies in Blue fresco shows women with accurate proportions, realistic features, detailed clothing. When they wanted realism, they achieved it. So, why do certain figures, always in religious or ceremonial contexts, look alien? The Minoans left no deciphered written language that explains their religion. Linear A, their script, remains undecoded. We have tablets, inscriptions, but we can't read them. Their beliefs, their mythology, their explanations of who they were worshipping. It's all guesswork based on archaeological evidence. What we know, the Minoans were sophisticated. They had indoor plumbing, multi-story buildings with load-bearing architecture, extensive trade networks throughout the Mediterranean, advanced metallurgy. They were astronomers. The palace complexes align with celestial events. They were also isolated. Crete is an island. Minoan civilization developed relatively independent of mainland cultures. Their art, their architecture, their social structure are unique. And then, around 1450 BCE, the civilization collapsed. The eruption of Thera, Santorini, devastated the island. Massive tsunamis, ash fall. The eruption was one of the largest in recorded history. It likely inspired the Atlantis myth. The Minoan civilization never recovered, but before the collapse, in their frescoes, they painted something. Beings with strange proportions, large eyes, elongated skulls. Were they depicting what they saw, or what they imagined, or what they were told? There's another angle. Elongated skull deformation was practiced by various ancient cultures, Paracas in Peru, certain Egyptian dynasties, tribes in Africa. Infant skulls were bound to create permanent elongation. The result is a distinctly non-human appearance. Some of the Minoan fresco figures have elongated skulls. Were the Minoans practicing skull deformation? If so, why? What were they trying to emulate? The standard answer: status. Beauty standards, tribal identity. The uncomfortable answer: they were trying to look like something they'd encountered or been told about. Beings that didn't look quite human. Crete sits at a crossroads. Trade routes from Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, all pass through Cretan ports. The Minoans would have been exposed to stories, myths, beliefs from across the ancient world. Stories of the Anunnaki from Sumeria, sky beings who descended and taught humanity. Stories of Egyptian gods with animal heads and superhuman powers. Stories of the Nephilim from biblical text. Giants born when sons of God mated with daughters of men. What if these stories were based on something? Not gods, not myths, but visitors, beings from elsewhere. And what if the Minoans, in their isolation, in their sophisticated astronomical observations, encountered or believed they'd encountered such beings? Their frescoes become documentation, attempts to record what they saw or were told. The elongated skulls, the large eyes, the strange proportions, these aren't artistic flourishes, they're attempts at accuracy. Speculation? Absolutely. But look at the frescoes. Really look. Those figures are different in ways that seem deliberate, specific, consistent. And then the civilization ended. The eruption buried Akrotiri in volcanic ash, preserving the frescoes perfectly, like Pompeii. Knossos was eventually abandoned. The knowledge, the beliefs, the explanations, lost. What survives are the images, figures that don't quite look human, painted with care, preserved by catastrophe. Make of it what you will. Heinrich Schliemann, the archaeologist who discovered Troy, excavates Mycenae. He opens a shaft grave and finds a gold funeral mask. He immediately telegrams the king of Greece, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." The mask is stunning. Heavy gold, beaten into the shape of a bearded face with closed eyes. Regal, commanding. exactly what a legendary king's death mask should look like. There's just one problem. It's not Agamemnon. The mask dates to around 1550 BCE. The Trojan War, if it happened, occurred around 1200 BCA. The mask is 350 years too old. Schliemann found the right city, but the wrong century. So, whose face is this? We don't know. The shaft graves at Mycenae contained multiple bodies, extensive gold artifacts, weapons, jewelry. Clearly important people, royalty certainly. But their names are lost, the mask has become iconic. It's the face of ancient Greece in museums worldwide. School textbooks use it to illustrate Mycenaean civilization. It's probably the most famous ancient Greek artifact after the Parthenon sculptures. And it's a lie, not a fake. The mask is genuine. But the attribution is false. Schliemann wanted glory. He wanted to find Agamemnon. So when he found a magnificent mask, he declared success and the name stuck. But here's where it gets darker. Some scholars think the mask isn't Mycenaean at all. The artistic style is different from other Mycenaean death masks. It's more realistic, more detailed. Most Bronze Age masks are stylized, symbolic. This one has individual features, a specific nose, distinct cheekbones, an actual person's face. The gold is also unusual. It's thicker than other masks from the period. The craftsmanship is more sophisticated. Some suggest it's later, possibly classical Greek, or even a modern forgery by Schliemann himself. Schliemann had a history of creative archaeology. He forged documents, he planted artifacts to enhance his discoveries. He dynamited through layers of Troy looking for treasure, destroying evidence. He wasn't above manipulating finds to fit his theories. Did he commission a goldsmith to create the Mask of Agamemnon? Did he plant it in the shaft grave? Some colleagues suspected as much, though they couldn't prove it. The Greek government certainly doesn't want that investigated too closely. The mask is a national treasure. It draws tourists. It symbolizes Greece's glorious past. If it's revealed as a forgery, the embarrassment would be immense. So, the mask remains in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, untested, unquestioned officially. The face of a king who never wore it, from an era when he hadn't been born, possibly created by a forger with more ambition than ethics. What disturbs me isn't the possibility of forgery. Forgeries happen. What disturbs me is the willingness to accept a comfortable lie because the truth is inconvenient. The mask serves a purpose. It gives Agamemnon a face. It makes the myths real. It connects modern Greece to its basis, legendary past. Testing it risks shattering that connection. Better to leave it unexamined. Better to keep the story intact. Better to let tourists photograph it, students study it, scholars reference it, never mentioning that the identification is questionable at best, fraudulent at worst. History is full of these comfortable lies. Artifacts misattributed, discoveries overstated, evidence interpreted to fit preferred narratives. The truth gets buried, not accidentally, deliberately. Because the truth is messy. The truth complicates things. The Mask of Agamemnon is beautiful. It might even be authentic, just not Agamemnon's. But we'll probably never know for sure, because some questions, once asked, can't be unasked, and the answers might be worse than the lies. They dominate the Mesopotamian landscape like artificial mountains, massive stepped pyramids rising in tiers toward the sky. The ziggurat of Ur, the remains of Babylon's Etemenanke, likely the inspiration for the Tower of Babel. These structures required millions of mud bricks, decades of labor, impossible coordination. The official purpose? Temples, houses for the gods. The upper platform held a shrine where priests performed rituals, where the gods supposedly descended from heaven to dwell among humans. Religious monuments, nothing more. Except ziggurats don't function well as temples. The upper platforms are small, exposed to elements, difficult to access. Daily worship happened in ground-level temples. The ziggurat itself was climbed rarely, only during specific ceremonies. So, why build something so massive if it's barely used? Recent studies suggest ziggurats had another purpose. They were technological structures. Specifically, they may have been designed to generate and harness energy. Consider the construction. Ziggurats aren't solid. They contain complex internal structures, drainage systems, ventilation shafts, chambers at different levels. The ziggurat of Ur has a hollow core with a network of shafts and passages. Why? Standard explanation: to prevent water damage. The shafts allowed moisture to escape, preventing the mud brick from deteriorating. Maybe, or maybe the shafts served another function. The Sumerians were obsessed with astronomy. Their mathematical system, Base 60, is still used to measure time and angles. They calculated planetary movements, predicted eclipses, tracked precession cycles spanning thousands of years. They understood electromagnetic principles enough to create the Baghdad battery. What if ziggurats were instruments, massive machines designed to collect and channel electromagnetic energy from the atmosphere? The structure acts as a step-down transformer. The different levels, the precise measurements, the internal chambers, all designed to resonate at specific frequencies. The ziggurat could have captured lightning, channeled atmospheric electricity, or resonated with Earth's natural electromagnetic field. Sounds like pseudoscience until you look at the acoustic properties. The ziggurat's terrace design creates natural amplification. Sound at the base is magnified at the peak. Ancient texts describe the ziggurats humming during ceremonies, producing sounds that could be heard for miles. Acoustic resonance at certain frequencies can induce altered states of consciousness. It can make people feel a presence, experience visions. Is that what the priests were doing, using the ziggurats as acoustic machines to induce religious experiences in worshippers? Or were they channeling something more tangible, energy that could be stored, used, distributed? The ziggurats were connected to temple complexes that controlled every aspect of Sumerian life. The priests weren't just religious leaders, they were administrators, engineers, astronomers. They controlled food distribution, organized labor, directed building projects. They held power, real power, and that power might have been literal. If the ziggurats generated energy, the priests who controlled them controlled a resource as vital as water or grain. When Sumerian civilization collapsed, when the cities were abandoned, the ziggurats stopped being maintained. They eroded. The knowledge of their true function was lost. Later, civilization saw ruins and assumed temple. They rebuilt for worship, not understanding the original engineering. Herodotus, visiting Babylon in the 5th century BCE, described the ziggurat of Etemenanki as having 8 tiers, each a different color, topped with a shrine containing only a table and a bed. He was told a woman spent the night there, chosen by the god. No priest was allowed to enter. Whatever happened in that chamber happened in private. What ritual was being performed? What was the bed for? The official explanation is sacred prostitution, the woman serving as the god's bride. But no ancient Mesopotamian texts actually describe this practice. It might be Herodotus misunderstanding or sensationalizing what he heard. Or it could have been something else. A chamber at the top of a massive technological structure where carefully selected individuals underwent what? Transformation, communication with something, exposure to energy fields generated by the ziggurat below. We're in speculation territory. But the structures remain, and their purpose isn't adequately explained by their temples. They're too complex, too precisely built, too consistently designed across different cities and time periods. The Sumerians were building something that required massive resources, sophisticated engineering, and knowledge that later civilizations didn't possess. And whatever that something was, it's been forgotten. Lost to time, to erosion, to the collapse of the civilization that built it. The ziggurats stand in ruins now, tourist attractions, archaeological sites, dead machines, if they were ever machines at all. But the design is there, the structure remains. And maybe, with modern technology, we could figure out what they were really for, if anyone dared to seriously try. It's the largest medieval manuscript in existence, 3 feet tall, 165 pounds, 310 pages of vellum, requiring the skins of 160 animals. The pages contain the complete Vulgate Bible, Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, medical texts, spells, and a full-page illustration of the devil himself. The Codex Gigas, the giant book, also known as the Devil's Bible. The legend is disturbing. A monk in the Benedictine monastery of Podlagis in Bohemia was sentenced to death by being walled up alive for breaking his monastic vows. He begged for mercy, promising to create a book that would glorify the monastery forever, a book containing all human knowledge. The abbot agreed, but gave him one night to complete it, an impossible task. So the monk prayed, not to God, to Satan. The devil appeared and agreed to help, in exchange for the monk's soul. Together, they completed the manuscript in a single night. The monk added the devil's portrait in gratitude. That's the legend. It's obviously folklore, obviously impossible, except the manuscript exists. And handwriting analysis suggests the entire thing was written by a single scribe. The handwriting is consistent throughout. Same pressure, same letter formation, same spacing. No variation that would suggest multiple sessions over months or years. Producing this much text consistently in one handwriting style would take a single scribe approximately 5 years of constant work. 8 hours a day, every day, for 5 years straight. But the consistency suggests it was done faster, much faster, under intense pressure or in a state of manic focus. The ink is consistent throughout, same mixture, same color, suggesting it was made in a single large batch. The vellum pages are uniform, meaning all 160 animals were slaughtered and processed together. The whole production was planned as a single project, not assembled over time. Whoever created this worked obsessively, perhaps monomaniacally. And then there's the portrait. On page 290, a full-page illustration of the devil. He's massive, green-skinned, horned, naked, except for a loincloth, crouched in a strange posture. The image is unique. Medieval devil illustrations usually show him as a dragon or a beast. This one is humanoid, but wrong. The proportions are unsettling. The expression is knowing. Across from the devil's portrait is a full-page illustration of the heavenly city, the kingdom of God. Heaven and hell facing each other. But here's what disturbs scholars. The heaven illustration is generic, conventional, unremarkable. The kind of thing any medieval scribe could copy from an existing manuscript. The devil portrait is original, detailed, rendered with care and artistic skill far exceeding the other illustrations in the codex. Whoever drew the devil knew what they were doing, and they spent time on it, made it perfect. Why? The codex also contains strange elements, pages that seem to be missing, dark stains where pages were removed, possibly cut out. What was on those pages? Why were they destroyed? The medical texts include procedures we'd now consider magic, spells for healing, exorcisms, curses. The manuscript contains the only complete copy of certain texts that were later banned by the church. The codex's history is violent. It moved from monastery to monastery, often during sieges or under mysterious circumstances. It was stolen by the Swedish army during the 30 Years' War and taken to Stockholm, where it resides in the National Library. In 2007, it was loaned to Prague, its first return to the Czech Republic in 359 years. The transfer required special equipment. The book is too heavy and fragile to be handled normally, and during the loan, people reported feeling uneasy around it. Museum staff described headaches, nightmares, a sense of being watched. Coincidence surely, power of suggestion. The Devil's Bible carries a reputation, and people project their fears onto it. Or maybe there's something about the manuscript itself, the obsessive labor that created it, the dark illustrations, the forbidden knowledge in its pages. Objects can hold intention. They can become vessels for the energy invested in their creation. The monk who made it, if the legend has any truth, poured years of his life into those pages, worked himself to exhaustion, made a pact, literal or metaphorical, with darkness to complete it. That kind of obsession leaves marks, not supernatural, psychological. The codex represents something disturbing. What humans are willing to do, what they're willing to sacrifice for immortality through creation. The monk's name is lost, his crime is unknown, his fate is unrecorded, but the book remains, his monument, his prison, his masterpiece, and his damnation. It sits behind glass in Stockholm. Visitors stare. Some reach out as if to touch, then pull back. The devil's eyes follow you. They don't, of course. It's just paint on vellum, but they feel like they do. Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book Library holds one of history's greatest mysteries, a 240-page manuscript from the 15th century, written in a language or code that nobody has ever deciphered. The Voynich manuscript. It's not encrypted nonsense. Linguistic analysis shows structure consistent with natural language, word frequency distributions, grammatical patterns, syntax that suggest meaning. It has the statistical properties of actual communication, but nobody knows what it says. The illustrations are almost more disturbing than the text. Botanical drawings of plants that don't exist, flowers with impossible structures, roots that defy biology, astronomical diagrams with unfamiliar symbols, biological drawings showing nude women bathing in pools connected by tubes, their bodies surrounded by strange organs or structures, pharmaceutical sections with labeled jars and plants, cosmological charts that don't match any known astronomical system. It's all rendered carefully, consistently, as if illustrating actual knowledge. But knowledge of what? Carbon dating places the vellum at 1404, Fahrenheit 38 CE. The manuscript was created in the early 15th century during the Renaissance, when knowledge was exploding. But this doesn't match any contemporary system of learning. The text uses an alphabet of approximately 25 characters, none matching any known script. Words are formed from these characters in patterns that suggest inflection, conjugation, grammar. Statistical analysis shows second-order entropy, meaning letters combine in consistent, non-random ways. It's not gibberish. It's not random. It means something. Theories abound. It's an artificial language created by the author. But why? For what purpose? It's encrypted, Hebrew, Latin, or another known language. Cryptographers have tried every cipher known to exist in the 15th century. Nothing works. It's a hoax created to defraud a wealthy collector. But the hoaxer would need to understand advanced linguistics to create text with natural language properties. That level of sophistication seems unlikely for a simple fraud. It's medical or alchemical knowledge, encoded to protect trade secrets. But alchemy used symbolic systems we can recognize. This doesn't match. The most disturbing theory? It's written in a language that no longer exists. A lost tongue, perhaps the private language of a small community, a sect, or a family. When the last speakers died, the language died with them. The manuscript has a dark history. It was likely owned by Emperor Rudolf II of Bohemia, who was obsessed with alchemy and the occult. It passed through the hands of various alchemists and scholars. Giordano Bruno might have seen it. Bruno, who was burned at the stake for heresy in 1600. John Dee, the notorious occultist and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, possibly owned it. These weren't casual collectors. These were men who pursued forbidden knowledge, who pushed boundaries, who were willing to risk execution for their studies. What did they see in the manuscript? What did they think it contained? In 1912, Wilfrid Voynich purchased it from a Jesuit college. He tried to decipher it. He failed. He showed it to the best cryptographers in the world. They failed. During World War II, top codebreakers, people who'd cracked Nazi Enigma machines, tried to read it. They failed. Computer analysis, artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms, all applied to the text. Nothing. The manuscript isn't just unreadable. It's resistant to decryption in ways that shouldn't be possible if it's a simple substitution cipher, or even a complex polyalphabetic cipher. What if it's not a cipher at all? What if it's genuine text in a language we don't know, describing knowledge we don't have? The botanical illustrations hint at this. Those plants don't match any known species. Botanists have tried to identify them based on similar features, this leaf shape plus that root structure. But nothing matches completely. Are they imaginary? Or are they extinct? Or from somewhere else? The biological section with the bathing women is particularly strange. The women are connected by tubes to structures that look organic but aren't clearly identifiable. Some scholars suggest it's gynecological or reproductive in nature. Others think it's cosmological, the women representing celestial bodies or forces. One disturbing interpretation. It's a guide to something experiential. The text might not describe facts but processes. How to achieve certain states of consciousness. How to perceive realities beyond normal experience. The illustrations might be mnemonic, triggering knowledge that isn't linguistic. If true, the manuscript can't be read in the conventional sense. It can only be understood by someone who's undergone the same experiences, the same training, the same initiation. The author encoded knowledge that requires context we don't have. Without that context, the text remains opaque. It's not that we're not smart enough to crack it, it's that we're missing the key that isn't linguistic but experiential. The Voynich manuscript sits in its climate-controlled case in New Haven. Scholars request access. They photograph pages, run analyses, publish papers proposing new theories. None have succeeded. The manuscript keeps its secrets. 240 pages of careful script, beautiful illustrations, obvious intelligence and purpose, saying nothing. To us, maybe saying everything. To someone else. In the courtyard of the Qutb complex in Delhi stands an iron pillar, 7 meters tall, 6 tons. Erected sometime around 400 CE, 1,600 years ago. It hasn't rusted. Iron rusts. That's what iron does, especially in Delhi's climate. Humid, monsoon rains, extreme temperature variations. Iron exposed to those conditions should be a pile of rust within decades. The Delhi pillar is pristine, smooth, solid, after 16 centuries. Metallurgical analysis reveals the secret. The iron contains an unusually high percentage of phosphorus. When exposed to oxygen and water, the phosphorus forms a protective passive layer, a thin mesawat coating that prevents further corrosion. So, the ancient Indians understood corrosion chemistry well enough to create rust-proof iron? The standard explanation is accident. The ore naturally contained high phosphorus. The smiths got lucky. Except the pillar is too perfectly composed. The phosphorus percentage is consistent throughout, suggesting controlled composition, not random luck. The iron is also remarkably pure, with very low sulfur and magnesium content. Achieving that purity requires sophisticated smelting techniques, and the pillar isn't crude. It's been hammer forged, meaning it was made by welding together many smaller pieces of iron in a massive coordinated project. The seams are invisible. The process would have required hundreds of blacksmiths working in perfect coordination, heating and hammering for weeks or months. This wasn't a local village project. This was an industrial undertaking requiring organization, technical knowledge, and resources. The inscription on the pillar dedicates it to the god Vishnu and mentions King Chandra, likely Chandragupta II, who ruled 375–415 CE. The pillar may have originally stood elsewhere, possibly topped with a Garuda, eagle figure, before being moved to its current location around 1100 CE. But here's what disturbs me. The Indians who made this pillar had corrosion-resistant iron in 400 CE. Europe wouldn't produce comparable rust-resistant iron until the 20th century. That's a 1,500-year gap. What happened? The technique wasn't lost gradually. Indian metallurgy continued for centuries, but later iron pillars rust, later iron implements corrode. The specific knowledge that created the Delhi pillar vanished. Was it a single master smith whose technique died with him? Was it a sect or guild that kept the method secret, and when they were destroyed or disbanded, the knowledge evaporated? Or was it deliberately suppressed? Iron that doesn't rust has military implications. Weapons that don't corrode. Armor that doesn't weaken. A technological advantage any kingdom would want to monopolize, or prevent enemies from having. If one kingdom possessed this knowledge and another conquered them, the conquerors might have killed anyone who knew the technique, destroyed the workshops, erased the records. Better that nobody has the advantage than riskier. Enemy acquiring it. The pillar stands as evidence that the knowledge existed, but the knowledge itself is gone. Modern metallurgists can analyze the composition. They can understand why it doesn't rust. But recreating the process, achieving that specific phosphorus content with 5th century technology, that's harder than it sounds. We've lost the practical knowledge, the specific ore sources, the exact smelting temperatures, the hammering techniques, the secrets passed from master to apprentice over generations. The pillar is also a reminder of how fragile knowledge is. A technique that took generations to develop can be lost in a single generation if the transmission is interrupted. War, disease, religious persecution, economic collapse. Any disruption can break the chain. And once broken, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. You can't reverse engineer tacit knowledge, the feel of the metal, the the sound it makes when it's the right temperature, the intuition developed over years of experience. The Delhi pillar has become a tourist attraction, a curiosity. People take selfies next to it, touch it for luck, though that's now prohibited to preserve it. Few understand they're looking at technology that surpasses anything Europe produced until the modern era. The pillar was advanced, and then that advancement was lost. And now we have one pillar, standing alone, rustless, silent about how it was made, a monument to what we've forgotten. The greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, founded by Ptolemy Sirmp around 300 BCE, expanded until it contained somewhere between 400,000 and 1,000,000 scrolls. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, literature, history. If it was written, the Library of Alexandria had a copy. Scholars traveled from across the known world to study there. Euclid developed geometry there. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference there. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model, the sun at the center of the solar system, 1,800 years before Copernicus. Then it burned, and humanity lost centuries of accumulated knowledge. Except it didn't burn once. It burned several times, and the burnings might not have been accidental. 48. BCE, Julius Caesar sets fire to the Egyptian fleet during his war with Ptolemy the Thirsil. The fire spreads to shore, damaging the library. Some scrolls are lost, but the library survives. 270 CE. During Roman Emperor Aurelian's campaign in Alexandria, parts of the city are destroyed. The library is damaged again, but it still functions. 391 CE, Christian Emperor Theodosius orders the destruction of pagan temples. The Serapeum, a temple complex that housed part of the library's collection, is demolished by a Christian mob. Thousands of scrolls are burned as pagan works. 640s CE. Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquers Alexandria. Caliph Umar supposedly orders the scrolls destroyed, saying, "If they agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are heretical. Either way, burn them." That last account is disputed. It might be Christian propaganda against Muslims, but the result is the same. By the 7th century, the Library of Alexandria was gone. Here's what disturbs historians. This wasn't accidental loss. This was systematic destruction spread over centuries. Different conquerors, different religions, same result. Knowledge burned because it was dangerous. What was in those scrolls? The works of Sappho. Only one complete poem survives. The complete works of Aristotle. Only about 1/3 survived, 2/3 lost. Aristarchus's heliocentric model, lost. For 1,800 years, Europe believed Earth was the center of the universe. Why burn it? Because knowledge is power. And those in power don't always want knowledge distributed. The Christian destruction wasn't about religion. It was about control. Pagan texts contained ideas that contradicted church doctrine. They contained scientific observations that challenged biblical literalism. They contained philosophies that promoted reason over faith. Better to destroy them. Better to control what people could read, what they could think, what they could know. The loss is incalculable. We don't even know what we don't know. The Renaissance happened when Europe rediscovered ancient texts, scrolls that survived in Byzantine and Islamic libraries, preserved by chance. Imagine if all the library's contents had survived. Human progress would have accelerated dramatically. The scientific revolution might have occurred in the 5th century instead of the 17th. Instead, humanity spent 1,000 years in darkness. Not because knowledge didn't exist, it did, but because it was destroyed, deliberately, by people who feared what knowledge might do. The Library of Alexandria is gone. The modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina, opened in 2002, is built near the original site, a memorial, a promise to preserve knowledge this time. But the scrolls are gone, burned, ashes scattered in the Mediterranean wind, and with them, centuries of human achievement, ideas that could have changed everything, erased. The most famous lost artifact in history, the golden chest, built according to God's precise instructions given to Moses on Mount Sinai. Inside, the stone tablets bearing the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, a pot of manna. The ark represented God's presence among the Israelites. It led them through the desert, it brought down the walls of Jericho, and then it vanished. The last definite biblical reference places the ark in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem around 950 BCE. By the time the Babylonians destroyed the temple in 587 BCE, the ark wasn't there. It had already disappeared. Where? Nobody knows. But here's what the Bible says the ark could do: kill people who touched it, strike entire armies with plagues, level fortifications. It was kept behind a veil in the Holy of Holies, accessible only to the high priest once a year on Yom Kippur. Even approaching it incorrectly meant death. Uzzah touched the ark to steady it when the oxen stumbled. He died instantly. The men of Beth Shemesh looked into the ark. 50,000 died, though some translations say 70. The Philistines captured the ark in battle. Tumors and disease swept through their cities. They returned it within 7 months, terrified. This isn't described as divine miracle. It's described as direct physical effect. Touch the ark, die. Capture it, your population develops tumors and hemorrhoids, symptoms that sound remarkably like radiation poisoning. What if the ark was a device, a technological artifact that the Israelites didn't understand but knew how to use based on precise instructions? The design is specific. Wood overlaid with gold, gold inside and out. 2 solid gold cherubim on top, with wings touching, creating an arch between them. Gold-plated poles for carrying. Never touch the ark itself. Gold is an excellent conductor. The design creates what's essentially a capacitor. 2 conductive layers separated by an insulator. The desert air, dry and full of static electricity, would charge such a device. Anyone touching it would receive a massive electrical shock, potentially fatal. The tumors and plagues. If the ark was radioactive or emitted some form of radiation, prolonged exposure would cause exactly those symptoms. The Israelites, following strict protocols, minimized exposure. The Philistines, ignorant of the dangers, suffered the full effects. This isn't religious speculation, this is engineering analysis. The ark, as described, would function as an electrical device. But there's a darker possibility. What if the ark was deliberately designed as a weapon? The ark was used in battle. It was carried before the Israelite army. Cities fell before it. Armies were struck with plague. It was the ultimate weapon, so powerful and terrifying that enemies fled at the sight of it. And then it disappeared. Ethiopian Christians claim it's in Axum, guarded by a single monk who can never leave the chapel. The Knights Templar excavated beneath Solomon's temple during the Crusades. They found something. When they returned to Europe, they became immensely wealthy and powerful. Did they find the ark? The ark is real. It existed. Thousands of people saw it. It can't have simply vanished, unless someone hid it, deliberately, because they knew what it was, knew what it could do. The Ark of the Covenant sits somewhere, waiting, dormant, lethal. November 1922. Howard Carter opens the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb is nearly intact, rare in Egypt, where grave robbery is ancient tradition. Inside, treasures beyond imagination, gold, jewels, furniture, chariots, and the mummy of the boy king himself. Within months, people start dying. Lord Carnarvon, Carter's patron, dies in April 1923, less than 5 months after the tomb's opening. Blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite, then pneumonia, then death. George J. Gould, an American financier who visited the tomb, died of fever 4 months later. Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey of Egypt was shot dead by his wife 6 months after visiting. Colonel Aubrey Herbert, Carnarvon's half-brother, died suddenly in September 1923. Over the next decade, more than 20 people connected to the tomb's opening died under unusual circumstances. The press called it the curse of the pharaohs. Modern scientists offer explanations. Fungal spores sealed in the tomb for 3,000 years. Aspergillus and penicillium species that can cause respiratory infections. The tomb was a time capsule of pathogens. But consider this. Egyptian tombs weren't just burial places. They were magical environments. Spells covered the walls, formulae to protect the deceased, to punish violators. The Egyptians understood poison. They understood biological agents. They mummified bodies using natron and resins, complex chemistry requiring sophisticated knowledge. What if the curse was engineered? What if tomb builders deliberately introduced pathogens, sealed them in the tomb, knowing that anyone who broke in would breathe deadly air? It's not mysticism. It's biological warfare, ancient biological warfare. The tomb of Tutankhamun was unusual. The king died young, around 18. The burial was hasty. The tomb is small, cramped, not fitting for a pharaoh. Objects are piled haphazardly, and Tutankhamun himself died mysteriously. Recent CT scans show a leg fracture shortly before death. Some suggest malaria. Others propose murder. The boy king was erased from history. His name was removed from king lists. His monuments were usurped by successors. He was meant to be forgotten. Why such effort to erase an 18-year-old who ruled for less than 10 years? Tutankhamun's father was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, who tried to replace Egypt's traditional polytheism with worship of a single god, the Aten. After Akhenaten's death, the old priesthood reasserted control. Tutankhamun began his reign as Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. He was later forced to change his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling his capitulation to the traditional priesthood. Was he killed for resisting? The break in his leg occurred shortly before death. Infection set in. He died. Convenient for the priests who opposed him. And his tomb was sealed with curses. Real curses. Biological agents that would sicken or kill anyone who entered. The treasures were bait. Gold draws grave robbers. The priests knew this, so they made the tomb rich, tempting, irresistible, and they made it deadly. For 3,000 years, it worked. When Carter opened it, the ancient trap sprang. People died. The curse was real, not supernatural, scientific. A deliberate defense mechanism. 20 people died. The tomb protected its secret. Long enough that we'll never know the full truth of who Tutankhamun was, what he knew, and why the priests wanted him forgotten. Xi'an, China, 1974. Farmers digging a well strike something hard, not rock, pottery. They keep digging and uncover a face, then another, then an army. 8,000 life-size terracotta warriors, each with unique features, individual expressions, different ranks and postures, archers, infantry, cavalry, officers, horses, chariots, an entire army buried in formation facing east, built to protect Emperor Qin Shi Huang in the afterlife. That's the official story. An enormous artistic project employing thousands of craftsmen, taking decades to complete, beautiful, impressive, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But look closer. The faces are too specific, too individual. These aren't generic soldiers. These are portraits. Each warrior was modeled on a real person. Each face is distinct. Different nose, different jaw, different expression. Why? Why give each statue a unique face? Mass production would be easier. Create a dozen molds, use them repeatedly. Faster, cheaper, more efficient. But they didn't. Every single warrior was individually crafted. Every face was unique, because they were meant to represent specific people. The terracotta army was created between 246–210 BCE during Qin Shi Huang's reign. The emperor was obsessed with immortality. He sent expeditions to find the elixir of life. He consumed mercury believing it would preserve him. He was terrified of death. He was also paranoid. He executed scholars, buried critics alive, burned books that contradicted his vision. The warriors weren't just art. They were vessels. Ancient Chinese believed in Hun and Po, components of the soul. At death, Hun ascends to heaven. Po descends to the earth. But both can be captured, bound, controlled through ritual. What if the terracotta warriors weren't just sculptures of soldiers? What if they contained the souls of soldiers? Each warrior's face is unique because it represents a real soldier, a soldier who was killed and whose soul was bound to the clay figure through ritual. The face was modeled on the corpse. The clay was mixed with ashes. The ritual transferred the Po, the earthly soul, into the terracotta. This isn't modern speculation. Chinese historical texts describe rituals for binding souls. Taoist practices involve capturing spirits in objects. The concept of hungry ghosts, souls trapped in the material world, is ancient. Archaeological evidence supports this. When the terracotta army pits were excavated, human remains were found nearby. Not craftsmen who died during construction, deliberate burials, bodies arranged in specific patterns, ritual sites. The number is significant, 8,000 warriors. But Qin's actual army was much larger, hundreds of thousands. Why only 8,000 terracotta figures? Because 8,000 soldiers were sacrificed. Their souls were harvested. Their faces were preserved in clay. When Qin died in 210 BCE, he was buried in the tomb. The workers who knew the layout were sealed inside, killed, so they couldn't reveal the tomb's secrets. The concubines who hadn't borne children were buried alive with him, and the army stood watch. 8,000 warriors, 8,000 trapped souls. Local legends speak of the site being haunted. Before 1974, farmers avoided the area. They reported strange sounds at night, marching footsteps, distant commands, the clatter of weapons. The warriors stand in their pits, silent, unmoving, individual faces staring forward with clay eyes. 8,000 soldiers, 8,000 souls, imprisoned, enslaved, bound for eternity to serve an emperor who died 2,200 years ago. Are they empty sculptures, or are they still there, trapped inside, aware, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to die because they're already dead? Nuremberg, 1493. The printing press has been around for 50 years. Books are spreading knowledge across Europe. The Nuremberg Chronicles, officially the Liber Chronicarum Egyptiae, is published. A comprehensive history of the world, from creation to the present. It's a massive undertaking. Over 7,800 illustrations. City views, portraits of historical figures, maps, genealogies, woodcuts of biblical events, all rendered in meticulous detail. The official content is standard medieval history, Bible stories, Roman emperors, saints, the march of civilization toward Christian redemption. Nothing controversial, nothing dangerous. But the illustrations tell a different story. Look at the city views. Dozens of cities are depicted. Nuremberg, Florence, Venice, Jerusalem, Constantinople. Each is labeled. Each looks distinct. Except they're not distinct. The same woodcut is reused multiple times, relabeled as different cities. The view of Damascus is identical to the view of Mantua. Bologna looks exactly like Lyons. This isn't laziness or cost-cutting. The Chronicles had a massive budget. The printers could afford unique woodcuts for each city. Instead, they deliberately reused images. Why? Because the images aren't depicting cities. They're depicting structures of power. Look closer at the architecture. The prominent buildings aren't churches or palaces. They're towers, walls, fortifications, structures of control. Each city is a node in a network of power. The repeated images suggest these cities are functionally identical. Different names, same control structure. The genealogies are even more revealing. The book traces lineages from Adam through various royal houses. Bloodlines are mapped obsessively. Who descends from whom? Which families connect to which? This information was power. In an era when legitimacy came from lineage, when royal claims depended on proving descent from previous rulers, these genealogies were weapons. Publish the right connections, and you legitimize a king. Omit connections, and you delegitimize rivals. The Nuremberg Chronicles were commissioned by wealthy patrons with political interests. The information wasn't neutral. It was curated to support specific power structures. And the maps. The world map shows Europe in detail. Asia is vague. Africa is sparse. The Americas don't exist. Columbus's voyage was too recent. But the map includes symbolic elements, monsters in the margins, strange lands labeled with biblical references. These aren't decorative, they're codes. Regions marked as monster lands were areas outside church control. Areas labeled with biblical references were claimed as spiritually significant, not for religious reasons, but to justify conquest. The map is a blueprint for expansion. The Chronicles were distributed widely, printed in Latin and German, affordable for wealthy merchants and minor nobility. This wasn't a book for scholars. It was propaganda disguised as history. It told readers, this is how the world works. This is who has power. This is the structure you exist within. Accept it. The really disturbing part? It worked. The Chronicles became the standard reference for history. Other books copied its structure, its interpretations, its biases. For centuries, this propagandistic view of history was taught as fact. The printing press was supposed to democratize knowledge. Instead, it was immediately weaponized to spread controlled narratives. The Nuremberg Chronicles proved that mass media manipulation didn't start with television or the internet. It started the moment information could be mass-produced. The Chronicles sit on library shelves, behind glass, in temperature-controlled rooms. Beautiful, historic, important, and still telling the same lies they told in 1493, still mapping the world according to power structures that haven't changed as much as we'd like to think. The code is there. You just have to know how to read it. A block of red sandstone, roughly rectangular, 26 inches by 16 inches, about 335 pounds. Unremarkable to look at. And yet, for over 1,000 years, it was the most fought-over object in British history. The Stone of Scone, the Stone of Destiny, the Coronation Stone. According to legend, it's the pillow Jacob used at Bethel when he dreamed of angels ascending to heaven. It traveled from the Holy Land to Egypt, to Spain, to Ireland, to Scotland. Every Scottish king was crowned upon it from the 9th century onward. In 1296, Edward the First of England invaded Scotland and stole the stone. He brought it to Westminster Abbey and built it into a wooden throne, the coronation chair. Every English monarch since has been crowned sitting above the Stone of Scone. Symbolism matters. By sitting on Scotland's stone, English monarchs claimed sovereignty over Scotland. The stone wasn't just a symbol, it was the physical embodiment of Scottish kingship. Stealing it was more than theft. It was magical warfare. Because the stone was supposed to have power, real power. The legends say the stone sings when the rightful king sits upon it. It was blessed by prophets. It conferred legitimacy. Without the stone, a coronation was incomplete. The Scots believed this. For 7 centuries, they demanded the stone's return. Treaties promised its return, promises that England repeatedly broke. In 1950, 4 Scottish students broke into Westminster Abbey and stole it back. They drove it to Scotland and hid it. A national manhunt ensued. The stone was eventually recovered and returned to Westminster. In 1996, 700 years after Edward the Wise stole it, the British government finally returned the Stone of Scone to Scotland. It now sits in Edinburgh Castle, displayed, safe, home. Except, there's a problem. It might not be the real stone. The stone Edward the First stole was described in medieval accounts as black, carved with symbols, possibly meteoric iron or a sacred black stone like the Kaaba. The Stone of Scone at Westminster was plain red sandstone. No carvings, no symbols. Local to Scotland, but unremarkable. Did the Scots switch it? Did they hide the real Stone of Destiny and give Edward a decoy? Medieval accounts suggest yes. The stone was supposedly hidden by monks at Scone Abbey before Edward arrived. The English got a fake. Where's the real one? Nobody knows. Theories place it at Dunsinane Hill, Iona, beneath a church, in a private collection. The knowledge of its location was passed down through specific families, supposedly, and then lost when the chain of transmission broke. But then why did Scotland care so much about getting it back? Why did students risk imprisonment to steal it? Why did the British government negotiate its return after 700 years? Because symbols have power. The stone represents something. Scottish sovereignty, independence, resistance to English domination, real or fake, carved or plain. It matters because people believe it matters, and belief shapes reality, not mystically, politically. A people who believe they have a right to self-determination will fight for it. A stone that embodies that right becomes a rallying point, a symbol worth dying for. The Stone of Scone in Edinburgh might be a decoy. The real stone might be hidden, its location lost. Or it might be in Westminster still, never returned. The stone sent to Scotland in 1996 being yet another switch in a Game of Thrones that's lasted a millennium. The truth is lost. What remains is symbol, legend, belief, and the uncomfortable reality that objects can hold power. So here we are, 30 artifacts, 30 pieces of evidence that history isn't what we've been taught, that the past is darker, stranger, and more deliberately obscured than any textbook admits. These aren't isolated mysteries, they're a pattern of knowledge lost, truths buried, evidence suppressed. From the Antikythera Mechanism proving ancient civilizations had technology we thought impossible, to the stone of scones symbolizing power stolen and never fully returned, each artifact reveals the same uncomfortable truth. Those in power control the narrative. They decide what gets preserved and what gets destroyed, what gets studied and what gets ignored, what gets celebrated and what gets erased. The Library of Alexandria burned, not once but repeatedly. Knowledge accumulated over centuries, gone in flames because it was dangerous, because it contradicted approved narratives, because it empowered people to think for themselves. The Terracotta Army stands as testament to an emperor so paranoid, so obsessed with control, that he enslaved 8,000 souls in clay to serve him in death. The Dead Sea Scrolls reveal that early Christianity was far more diverse than church history admits, that texts were deliberately excluded from the Bible, that entire theological traditions were erased. The Baghdad Battery, the Ulf Barrett swords, the Iron Pillar of Delhi, all prove that ancient peoples had technological knowledge that was lost when civilizations fell, when traditions were disrupted, when knowledge holders were killed or silenced. And the pattern continues today. We tell ourselves we live in an age of information, of transparency, of accessible knowledge. But information is curated. Search algorithms decide what you see. Social media platforms control what spreads. Governments classify documents. Corporations protect trade secrets. Museums keep artifacts in storage, inaccessible to researchers. The methods have changed. The goal is the same. Control what people know, and you control what they believe. Control what they believe, and you control who they are. These 30 artifacts survived by accident. They were buried, forgotten, overlooked, or considered unimportant. When they were rediscovered, they challenged narratives that powerful people wanted to maintain. So they were explained away, reinterpreted, or their implications were minimized.